Chapter 70. The Een bead Zo Mo concentrated as his hands moved according to Pu Yao's instructions. His hands moved like fluttering butterflies and activated the spell. The benefits of consistently practicing Art of Flora was evident in the fluid motions of his fingers. This spell, which Pu Yao called Art of Concentrating Een, was complicated, but it wasn't too difficult for Zwa Mo. Zwa Mo felt the Een energy in the surrounding stir. The energy was saturated with a dark and cold presence, causing all the hair on his body to stand on end, but he gritted his teeth and persisted. The Een energy continued to gather in his hands. After the last movement was completed, a gray-white bead condensed in Zwa Mo's hands. Zwa Mo curiously examined the bead. "Pu, what is this?" The bead was a dirty white color, extremely plain, and felt cool in his hands. "This is a Een bead, created through concentrating Een energy. It can be used in dan making or forging. The effect is especially beneficial for Een attribute talismans." Pu Yao's expression was smug as he glanced at Zwa Mo disdainfully. "The Een energy in this place is very abundant. As long as you do not slack off, and make a few more each day, Jingshi will naturally roll in. What I think is you should change your sect. I have never seen such a poor sect. In your sect, other than that Shixiang of yours, everyone is just trash." Zwa Mo volleyed back. "You, a so-called Sky Yao that was wounded by my second Sherbwa, you have the face to say this." Pu Yao snorted icily. "If I hadn't been forged under the tower for 3,000 years and my spirit terribly wounded, how could a Jin Dan trash cut me?" He was extremely disgruntled. Zwa Mo followed with an icy snort. "I finally understand how you became a Sky Yao." Pu Yao blanked. "How?" "You about it." Zwa Mo couldn't resist and roared with laughter, pointing first at Pu Yao and then pointing at the sky. "A Yao, blowing up into the sky, becomes a Sky Yao. Ha ha. I'm too lazy to even pay attention to you." Pu Yao wasn't angry. He spread his arms and there wasn't any movement, but the Een energy suddenly started to move. He was like the eye of a horrifying whirlpool, the Een energy in the surroundings to rush toward him. "Are you sure that this thing is really worth money?" Not paying attention to Pu Yao, Zwa Mo started at the Een bead on his hand and asked with uncertainty. Pu Yao, who had been enjoying the experience of absorbing Een energy, felt a vein in his forehead start to throb. His movements suddenly stopped and he almost choked in annoyance. Since Pu Yao said that the Een bead was very valuable, Zwa Mo held a trustful attitude. He decided to make a few more, but he found that all the Een energy in this area was all pulled towards Pu Yao. He couldn't manage to form a Een bead and had to move to another location further away. Luckily, there was only one path in the Sword Cave. Zwa Mo didn't need to worry about getting lost. After walking for a while, finding that he wasn't affected by Pu Yao any longer, he started to make Een beads. It wasn't too difficult to make Een beads. The finger motions were slightly complicated, but to Zwa Mo it wasn't a problem. In one go, he made about 20 beads before he stopped. After making the Een beads, Zwa Mo started to examine the surroundings. What aroused his curiosity the most was the blood river not far away. The river seemed to be composed of a sticky blood. There wasn't any sound of flowing. For some reason, Zwa Mo felt his heart tremble whenever he saw this silent river of blood. He picked up a rock from the ground and threw it into the blood river. It was as though the rock had landed in quicksand. It did not make a splash, it slowly sunk into the river. "For your sake, don't touch it. It's blood fiends." Pu Yao's voice suddenly came from behind. He said with some regret, "Pity I'm not a blood Yao, otherwise this would be very beneficial. What are blood fiends?" Zwa Mo couldn't help asking. "You wouldn't understand even if I told you." Pu Yao never let a chance to mock Zwa Mo slip by. He scanned the surroundings and made a sound of surprise. Rationally, such a cruel place, there would be some malicious spirits like devilings. Why is it so clean? "What are devilings?" Zwa Mo asked again. "Delicious things." Pu Yao's bright red tongue couldn't help run across his lips, while an expression of yearning flashed across his face. After searching for a long time, he was slightly dazed and sighed. "Your Shixiang is really too honest of a person. He actually didn't even spare one of them. It looks like it needs a while to recover." Refreshed, Pu Yao waved his hand at Zwa Mo. "Let's go." Finishing, he threw out 4 pieces of Jingshi. Zhuomo's expression changed dramatically again. This time, he didn't even need to check his pocket as he wailed grievously, "Pu Yao!" The white light rose and his voice stopped. Returning to the little west wind yard, Zhuo wanted to cry. 8 pieces of third-grade jingsher. Going there and back, so much was gone. Just like that, half of all the jingsher he had earned by furiously making Dan was gone. "Don't look that sad," Pu Yao unconcernedly said with a face full of disdain. "When you sell the yin beads, you'll get your costs back with profit. You really are trash. Just 8 pieces of jingsher, and you are this distraught. You really are making a profit." Entering the sword cave once, it requires 2 jindan trash to both be present. Using 8 pieces of third-grade jingsher to invite 2 jindan trash, can you get a better bargain than that? Zhuo could do nothing. He could only pray that the 20 yin beads he had made would sell for a good price. He knew that the yin beads could not be sold through the sect. The origins of the yin beads wasn't clear. If he aroused the suspicions of the Sherbois, then no matter how many lives he had, he would still die. He decided to go sell them himself in Dongfu. To not attract attention, he didn't ride the gray-beaked goose. Rather, he silently left the mountain. As he arrived at the outskirts of the mountain, he darted into the forest. When he came out, he appeared completely different. He had turned into a weak-looking man with a waxy complexion. In Elder Wei Nan's Jade Scrolls, there were endless methods of changing appearances and concealing one's tracks. Zhuo had picked a method that wasn't very difficult. This was the first time Zhuo put on a disguise. He was very curious and found it strange. Right now, he was regretful that the spirit traveling seal had been burnt. If he had the spirit traveling seal, he could save some time. His flying paper crane was too eye-catching, so he could only walk. Even though his cultivation had increased greatly, his body was still very weak. Exhausted, he arrived at Dongfu after walking over the mountains and rivers. However, his thirst for jingsher and his enthusiasm won over his weariness. Almost crawling, he stumbled into the free market. With great pain, he rented a mini-room. Zhuo set up a shop. Zhuo had been to the free market many times, but it was the first time that he was selling something. He didn't think about earning a profit. He would be grateful if he could just earn back the 8 pieces of third-grade jingsher. He put out a price of half a third-grade jingsher for each yin bead. He was very worried. He thought about how Pu Yao had boasted how good this thing was. At the very least, it must be worth half a third-grade jingsher. Of course, Pu Yao was full of disdain towards Zhuo's conduct. He snorted coldly, "The honored yin bead." The meaning was implicit. After 6 hours had passed, the last golden rays of sunlight shone on Zhuo's face. "This is the jingsher rolling in? This is the thing you said was good? This is getting back profits along with cost? Honored yin bead." Zhuo was grieving as he demanded answers from Pu Yao. A whole entire afternoon, no one had even stopped in front of his mini-room. Up until now, Zhuo hadn't even sold 1 yin bead. He still had to pay the rent for the mini-room as well. Pu Yao also stared blankly. He muttered for a while, not knowing what to say. After a long time, his face was full of disbelief. He suddenly threw his hands up in exasperation. "How is that possible? This is the yin bead. Yin bead. After 3,000 years, how can people not even want a yin bead?" Seeing Pu Yao lose his composure, Zhuo didn't feel the heartache as much anymore. He had already started to accept this cruel reality. He snorted coldly, "In the future, stop posturing like a Sky Yao. Look at the era, Sky Yao. 3,000 years, your things, they are relics, they have become obsolete. Understand? You made me excited for nothing." After a while, "Ji will give it to the children to use as marbles." Pu Yao's expression was subdued. It was clear that this incident had dealt a harsh blow to him. At this time, a little girl passed by Zhuo's mini-room and suddenly stopped. Zhuo, who had been preparing to start criticizing Pu Yao again, suddenly stopped talking and enthusiastically said, "Miss, do you want to buy? This is a good thing, yin bead, completely formed from pure yin energy. Can be taken anywhere. Cool in the summer, and has the effect of beautifying the complexion." The little girl looked like a maid. Hearing this, she laughed lightly. "You really know how to advertise." Her brows suddenly creased. But these beads are too ugly. If it was rainbow-colored, Miss would definitely like it. Miss, don't just look at the outward appearance. The quality is very fine. Look how round and heavy it is. In order to make his very first transaction, Zhuo completely had no shame. Seeing Zhuo actually promoting the beads like marbles, Pu Yao stared with a wide mouth, his gaze dull. Since you've said so much, I'll buy one. The little girl covered her mouth and laughed. She took out the jingsher and bought one. Before she left, she urged him kindly, I see you are an honest person. In the future, you should sell reliable things. These gray beads, no one would buy them. Finishing, she turned and left. Zhuo collapsed to the ground. He had finally sold one, and it wasn't easy. Compared to him, Pu Yao's soul had been mortally wounded. His expression was dull, his complexion was gray. Seeing Pu Yao's state, Zhuo couldn't help but urge, it's nothing. Just business. Next time, we'll sell something else. At the least, making golden crow pills isn't bad. 3,000 years have passed, you need to adapt. One person and one Yao snuck back to the mountain. In a small yard in Dongfu Hall. Miss, I'm back. A cheerful voice passed out from the door. Yun Xia Xianzi's little yellow bird flew up and rushed at the door. Yun Xia Xianzi was embroidering a handkerchief and made a sound of acknowledgement, her head not raising from her work. You brat, we just arrived and you instantly disappeared. A figure rushed in. It was the smiling and adorable little girl. The yellow bird flew around the little girl, chirping. The little girl said with a face full of helplessness to the yellow bird, Okay, Miss Yellow, Huang, I got you something good to eat. If Zhuo heard this, he would definitely have spat up blood. The Miss Huang was really just a bird. Finishing, she took out a large pile of things and narrated, there is the 5-flower cake from the food pavilion, the lotus and lily crisps, 13 flavored sweets. This is the famous Old Wang liquor. Don't drink too much, otherwise Miss will discipline you again. The yellow bird's eyes were gleaming. Suddenly, it saw a gray bead. Like an arrow, it rushed into the pile and picked up the gray bead. You like this bead? The little girl was very surprised. The yellow bird picked up the bead with its beak and flew Ito Yun Xia Xianzi, placing the bead onto her handkerchief. When Yun Xia Xianzi's eyes spotted on the bead, she exclaimed in surprise and she stopped what she was doing. Picking up the bead for a closer inspection, her expression couldn't help but change slightly. Xiao Yuan, where did the bead come from? Chu A is used as boasting, but also means being blown as in blown away by the wind. Huang also means yellow. Chapter 71, A New Experiment, Bought it. Yun Xia Xianzi's grave tone scared Xiao Huan. She stammered, I bought it for half a third-grade jingsher. At the free market. I felt the seller was very pitiful and bought one. Pitiful? Yun Xia Xianzi's brow furrowed, half a third-grade jingsher? Yes, Xiao Huan hurriedly nodded her head, that person was so sad. A whole afternoon and he didn't even sell one. When he was promoting it to me, he really was so pitiful so I bought one for Miss Yellow to play with. Miss, what is it? This is a bead. Yun Xia Xianzi's face was grave as she explained, beads are made from energy and are very rare. The method to form beads is very unique. It has been lost for a long time. There are many uses for this bead. I know of one method to forge this into a thunder bead. It would be very powerful. That's strong. Xiao Huan almost couldn't believe it, but I felt that person was very sad. If beads are that powerful, why couldn't he sell it for half a third grade of jingsher? Therefore, you got a bargain, Yun Xia Xianzi said. In this world, there are always some eccentric people that enjoyed tricking the world for amusement, but her tone was not confident. Miss, why don't you go with me to find the person again? I remember where he was. Xiao Huan hurriedly said, this way, Miss might be able to request the method to form the bead. If not, you could still buy all the beads. Hearing this, Yun Xia Xianzi quickly stood. After returning to the mountain, Zhuo started his dan-making job once again. The bead was just a little detour. He just mourned the loss of 8 pieces of third-grade jingsher for a while. But the effect of this incident was even greater to Pu Yao. Pu Yao was silent for quite a few days, but he didn't have a solution. After 3,000 years, things would have changed. At least, that was what Zuemo thought. Zuemo temporarily didn't have time to investigate the use of the Yin beads. He had too many things he needed to do. The sales of the Golden Crow pills was very good, but that also meant he needed to spend more time on dan making, especially in this situation where he needed Jingshi. Even more, the temptation of the 4th grade fire seed wasn't just for others. It was a temptation even for him as well. But after swallowing 50 Golden Crow pills, Zuemo didn't form Golden Crow fire. Each time, he could feel a sliver of heat absorbed into his body, and just as quickly, the heat was like melting ice, gone in the blink of an eye. This made him very suspicious of the effectiveness of the Golden Crow pill. Even though it was a Lingdan that he made, but about its effectiveness, he wasn't confident at all. 50 Golden Crow pills. Converting that to Jingshi, it wasn't a small amount. His heart hurt slightly and he was puzzled. Was it that the sun essence inside the Golden Crow pill too little? The reason that the Golden Crow pill had been judged to be able to form Golden Crow fire was that it contained essence of the sun, but the amount was extremely small. If he wanted to rely on the pill to form Golden Crow fire, he didn't know how many he had to use. Suddenly, he was reminded of an idea he once had when he had been making the Golden Crow pills. If he used Art of Crimson Flame as the primary and the Li Fire Seal formation as the auxiliary, what would the Lingdan he made be like? At the time, he had 3 different choices. This had been one of them. At the beginning, he had abandoned this plan of action because it changed the relationship between the primary and auxiliary fires, which would affect many other things. But now, he had enough time to think about resolving the problems. Also, after making Golden Crow pills all this while, he had accumulated rich experience. If he used that method to make Lingdan, the amount of essence of the sun definitely wouldn't be small. He decided to try even though the chance of failure was very large. The creation of the first Golden Crow pill had been accidental. In the middle, he had experienced numerous failures, but the Golden Crow pill had also given him enormous profits. He had gotten a good taste. Deciding to move immediately, he went back into his dan room. Without any doubt, his first time was a failure. Zuemo once again smelt the familiar burnt smell. He wasn't downcast. Failure was within his expectations. And compared to last time, he was much richer. The ingredients of the fasting pill were all open for him to access. To use Art of Crimson Flame as the primary flame and the Li Fire Seal formation as the auxiliary flame. It appeared to be a simple change, but it resulted in extremely complicated changes. First, the balance in strength of Art of Crimson Flame and Li Fire Seal formation had to be adjusted. Also, it was unknown if the ingredients of the original recipe were strong enough to tolerate a larger amount of sun essence. Of the two, he was more concerned about the second point. How to pair ingredients and the ratios was a field of extremely deep study. Even his master didn't have a good grasp. He was worried that if the ratio had to be changed and it required higher-level Linggrasses, then would he be able to support it? Even with his steadily increasing wealth, if he went to buy the ingredients for dan making, especially those high-level ingredients, then he could only be able to window shop. He began his dull experiments. He had a jade scroll by his hands that recorded down the general conditions of each of his attempts. He knew that he didn't have as much knowledge and experiences as his master. The only thing he could do was advance little by little, trying again and again. In the eyes of many others, this was certainly the dumbest method, but it was the only choice Zuemo had. Just as Zuemo was trying to make a new Lingdan, Yun Xia Xianzi and her maid, Xiao Huan, were scouring the free market daily, trying to find that waxy-faced man who was selling marbles. In the following days, Zuemo didn't make any progress. Pu Yao suddenly, of his own accord, said to Zuemo, "I'll teach you to use the Yin beads to forge something. Go sell it, it would definitely sell for a good price." "What?" Zuemo asked inattentively. Right now, his head was entirely filled with how to make a new Lingdan. "Yin Thunder Bead," Pu Yao said confidently. "People may not recognize Yin beads, but Yin Thunder Beads, people would definitely recognize it." "Pu." Zuemo decided to communicate with Pu Yao. 3,000 years. "Your things, are the things from 3,000 years ago. No one knows of them now. If they don't know, then they won't buy it, and no one buying it means no jingsher. Pu Yao said, unsatisfied, "Do you think everyone is as ignorant and shut off as you? And have you not heard of thunder beads before?" Looking at the stubborn Pu Yao, who still wasn't accepting reality, Zhuo Mo shook his head. "Don't waste my time." Pu Yao raged, Stop." Zhuo Mo turned around. "Don't say you're a Sky Yao." Pu Yao almost choked on air. Looking at Pu Yao's depressed expression, for some reason, Zhuo Mo felt good. The tiredness of the last few days seemed to have disappeared. He was smug as he went back into the Dan room and started a new round of experiments. After going to the Sword Cave once, Zhuo Mo's fear of Pu Yao seemed to have flown away in the span of one night. This kind of joke, he wouldn't have dared to make it before. After the sect assessment, Zhuo Mo seemed to have spent all his time on making Golden Crow pills. This directly caused the skill of his Art of Crimson Flame to have increased dramatically. It was a pity that without the Jade Scrolls of the next level, he still couldn't break through to the next level. Right now, he was able to easily manipulate the strength of the Art of Crimson Flame. As the reputation of the Golden Crow pill increased in Dongfu, it quickly became the trademark Lingdan of Wukong Sword Sect. To help Zhuo Mo in making Golden Crow pills, Yan Lesherbua had specially bought a second-grade Dan cauldron for Zhuo Mo. He was the envy of many other people. During the sect assessment, Zhuo Mo's reputation had increased with his spectacular performance. His opponent Luo Li had been wounded too, but he didn't have a master that could make Dan. Shifeng Rong was angry at Luo Li for going too far, and she treated him as though he was air. As a result, it took Luo Li's wounds a month to heal. When the news that eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing, Su Yi, and Su Yi Xia went to see Zhuo Mo passed into his ears, Luo Li almost spat blood. The energies became unbalanced and his recovery was delayed for 10 days. During the time that Luo Li had been recuperating, other than the first few days, Haomin didn't visit him or ask about him. The sect leader had visited him once, which had greatly moved Luo Li. After recovering, Luo Li instantly entered seclusion. He seemed to have suddenly disappeared. Everyone had discussed for a while before getting tired of it. Undoubtedly, other people's impressions of zombies Mo Shixiang improved greatly. In Dongfu Hall, everyone had gathered together. However, no one's expression was good. Many days had passed, but they still hadn't found anything. There were very few traces left from the stars in daytime. They couldn't detect the general location, and as time passed the traces that were left would decrease. Therefore, the chance that they would find the wounded Yao Ma would decrease as well. Dongfu is really too popular. There are too many energies that are moving through. The marks left from the event have dissipated, Yuan Li grimaced. He was the individual most skilled with detecting energies in this group. Everyone had high hopes pinned on him. But up until now, he wasn't able to even find a trace, and he felt embarrassed. Yun Xia Xinzi comforted, "Mr. Yuan, don't rush. We are here to do our best, and the rest is up to fate. Have you all noticed that, other than us, there seems to be another group that is trying to find the Yao Ma?" a silver coronet cultivator said. "Oh, has Wentai Sanren found something?" Yun Xia Xinzi couldn't help ask. "I keep on feeling that someone is following us in the dark. Has anyone else felt it?" Wentai Sanren said worriedly. "I have also had this feeling," Yuan Li nodded. Yun Xia Xinzi's beautiful eyes scanned the surroundings. Seeing the assorted expressions, she couldn't help but sigh inside. If the Gem Master was here, would they be like this? Everyone was about equal in their cultivation and they were all proud people. They usually cultivated alone. Coming here this time, most people were doing it out of obligation. Without a strong person to lead, they were like a pile of sand. "Old He, can you not just stare at the Lingdan? Have you found anything?" Yun Xia Xinzi said with a smile. "Found? No, the one called Old He was an old man. His hair and beard were white, his skin wrinkled. He was skilled in the art of Dan making. He had been invited to come, but he usually didn't speak. However, he was of profound and unknown cultivation and no one dared to underestimate him." He suddenly sighed. "Dongfu might be a small place, but it still has some pearls. This Golden Crow pill, The maker was able to think of adding essence of the sun into the Dan. This old one admires them. What's the use? Yun Li's brows furrowed and he asked unconcernedly. It may be possible to form 4th grade golden crow fire, old he slowly drawled. Hearing this, everyone instantly quieted. Chapter 72, Seeing Guests, 4th grade golden crow fire? When Tai Sanren looked with disbelief at the little Lingdan in old he's hands, I see that there isn't much Ling energy in this Lingdan. It can't even enter 2nd grade. Can this really make golden crow fire? The other people also had varying levels of disbelief on their faces. A 1st or 2nd grade Lingdan that was able to create a 4th grade golden crow fire sounded delusional. 4th grade golden crow fire was a rare fire seed that people dreamed of. Other than a few sects who had the methods of creating and capturing it, there basically was no other method of obtaining it. If a person could obtain 4th grade golden crow fire through consuming just one kind of Lingdan, even if this Lingdan was 4th grade, there would be countless people wanting to buy it. The people present were all Jindan Shio. They knew very well that the gap between lower and higher grades wasn't something overcome through sheer numbers. This was also why the price difference between lower and higher grade items was enormous. But now they were hearing that a Lingdan that didn't surpass 2nd grade Lingdan, it could make golden crow fire. It was like hearing a joke. If the person who said it wasn't old he, the most skilled in Dan making among them, everyone would have thought that he was insane. This is a 1st grade Lingdan. Old he wasn't rushed and slowly said, it contains a sliver of essence of the sun. This essence of the sun, after the Dan was made, is warm and easy to manipulate. Theoretically, it has a possibility of forming golden crow fire. Of course, only theoretically. Only now did everyone release a breath, and they gave "it ought to be so" expressions. This amount of sun essence is too little. To form golden crow fire, if there wasn't tens of thousands of pills, it probably wouldn't happen. But even if this sun essence cannot form golden crow fire, but it is extremely young and pure. It is perfect for adding into other fire seeds. Everyone here naturally doesn't need it, but it is a very good present for the next generation, old he said with a smile. Hearing this, everyone nodded. Without an exception, they were all Jindan. If this could make golden crow fire, they would be interested. But if it was just essence of the sun, it wasn't very attractive to them. Those seated here were not roaming Shio and they had many disciples. Even if they were roaming Shio, they would still have disciples. The grade of golden crow pill was low, but that bit of sun essence, it could be added to all kinds of fire seed and elevate the grade of those fires. It is a very useful Lingdan, and would be perfect to use in rewarding disciples. With old he's words, this is pretty good. Where can we buy this golden crow pill? Hearing that the Lingdan contained a sliver of essence of the sun, she couldn't help but ask. The other people also waited to hear expectantly. It's a little sect called Wukong Sword Sect. Old he turned to ask Tiansong Zi, are you familiar with the sect? Tiansong Zi was surprised to hear about Wukong Sword Sect. Hearing old he's question, he hurriedly answered, Wukong Sword Sect is usually low-key. If it wasn't for a recent incident, I wouldn't have noticed that there is a local sect this strong. How so? Yuan Li asked curiously. As a Jindan Xiozha, Tiansong Zi's cultivation wasn't weaker than them, and his branch had always held power in Dongfu. To be called a strong sect by him, the sect's power couldn't be underestimated. Seeing everyone show curiosity, Tiansong Zi slowly narrated, speaking of Wukong Sword Sect, we have to mention the recent apparition. In this generation of Wukong Sword Sect, there is an amazing genius called Wei Sheng. This person is of low birth but is obsessed with the sword. To be able to cultivate the sword, he was willing to be a sword servant. After working and studying hard, he finally reached Zhuji. In his Zhuji, the sword essence flew into the heavens and rang into the surroundings. I personally saw it and went to look in the deep of the night. Only then did I discover that this Wukong sword sect merits great fame. Has anyone heard of Ice Dragon Sword? When Tai Sanren's expression changed, that Ice Dragon Sword, that shocked all of Yao Hunt in the past? The others also gave shocked expressions. Just the person, Tiansong Zi nodded, I'm ashamed to admit it. If it wasn't that there had been an apparition when Wei Xing entered Juji, I wouldn't have known such an able person was in our Dongfu. The golden crow pill that old he is speaking about was made by Wukong sword sex Shi Feng Rong. She is of Jindan cultivation, and the most skilled in dan making of Wukong sword sex for Jindan. Yu Bai was better informed on the topic than Tiansong Zi, and he immediately followed. Master might not know, this golden crow pill wasn't made by Elder Shi, but her disciples were Mo. Supposedly, it was an accident when he was just starting to learn. This disciple has pretty good talent in dan making. Old he couldn't help but praise. Tiansong Zi's expression couldn't help but change and suddenly blurted, this Wukong sword sect is really going to rise. Seeing the other people look at him, he explained, everyone may not know, this Mo was unknown before, but he managed to achieve a spring sprout jade metal with Lianqi cultivation. His talent is astounding. And in Lianqi, he also managed to comprehend sword essence. This talent is exceptionally amazing. I hadn't thought he would be so talented in dan making. The heavens have really blessed Wukong sword sect. The other people also had expressions of agreement on their face. Of the 3 points that Tiansong Zi mentioned, just one was enough for a person to be considered exceptional, but to have all 3 qualities in one person? That definitely was a once-in-100 years genius. Wukong sword sect, with an accomplished master like Ice Dragon Sword and geniuses like Wei Xing and Zue Mo in the next generation, it was almost certain to have 100 years of prosperity. The people seated thought of their own sex and had different thoughts. Since Ice Dragon Sword is actually in Dongfu, why don't we pay him visit and order a batch of golden crow pills while we are at it, huh? What does everyone think? Oldie said. In this group of people, he had the greatest interest in Wukong sword sect. The others all agreed. Everyone seated here was cunning. To build good relations with a sect that was going to prosper, the benefits in the future didn't need to be stated. Zue Mo was seated in front of the Dan cauldron with his 2 hands on the 8 trigrams plate. His expression was focused. A clear gold-colored light came down and landed in his hand before deflecting towards the Dan cauldron. He had reached the limits of what he could do with Art of Crimson Flame, and he reduced the Li Fire Seal formation to the smallest it could get. Inside the cauldron, a ball of medicine was enveloped by the golden light, boiling relentlessly as it floated in the air. The Li Fire Seal formation below released heat. Feeling the essence of the sun slowly merge into the liquid, Zue Mo suddenly increased his awareness. He knew that the most crucial time had come. The speed that the sun essence merged at was extremely slow at the beginning, but after entering the liquid, it would suddenly increase. It was important to carefully control the power of Art of Crimson Flame. If he wasn't careful, he would lose everything. Zue Mo had failed many times at this crucial juncture. A gray smoke suddenly appeared out of the boiling liquid. Zue Mo mentally thought it was going wrong, but before he could react, the liquid turned into a ball of ash. Damn it! Zue Mo sat dispiritedly. After continuously making dan, his Ling energy was almost exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot and his expression tired. The dan room was filled with the remnants of failed dan. The smell was nasty. Up until now, he hadn't succeeded once. However, it wasn't as though he hadn't learned anything. Today, just in this last attempt, he finally found the problem. In the various kinds of materials for the fasting pill, there was one material that couldn't tolerate such a high intensity of sun essence. Sun essence might look light and small, but it was much stronger than the Li Fire Seal formation. This Ling grass called Thousand Jade Grass, it couldn't endure being processed by such a strong flame. He needed to find a Ling grass that could endure the increase in the essence of the sun, with similar attributes to Thousand Jade Grass. Zue Mo couldn't help but have a headache. This was the problem that he was most worried about encountering. When it came to the attributes and the theory of the medicine, he was totally blind. He gave a sigh. It seemed that his idea would have to be realized in the future, but he was still unsatisfied inside. He decided to take a good look in Master's record room to see if he could find a Ling grass similar in effect as Thousand Jade Grass. As he pondered, he walked out of the Dan room. Shi Xiang. Su Qing saw Zue Mo walk out of the Dan room and her eyes brightened. She hurriedly came over. That big ship has come to our sect. Big ship? What big ship? Zuomo's mind was scattered and asked instinctively. Doesn't Shixiang remember? The big ship that had flew above us before. Su Qing reminded. The big ship that flew over. Zuomo suddenly shook and was startled away. That extremely intimidating ship had left a big impression on him. He hurriedly asked, "What's the ship doing here?" "Don't know," Su Qing shook her head. "They seem to be conversing very well with the Sherbois, but I heard that they were here investigating the stars in daytime." Stars in daytime? Zuomo felt his throat tighten. He suddenly thought of this term that the pink paper crane had also said to him. For some reason, he seemed to feel that this stars in daytime was connected to him. Did Shixiang forget? Oh, right, I remember. Shixiang had been in Zhuji that day. In a piteous tone, she said, "Pity that Shixiang hadn't seen it. Stars coming out in daylight, it's very rare." Zuomo felt that his body was slightly cold. If before he had just felt that it was connected to him, then now he was certain that this stars in daytime was definitely connected to him. How could there be such a coincidence? Just him, he definitely wouldn't connect the apparition with himself. He couldn't, but Pu Yao could. Thinking about it, he left Su Qing and quickly went back into the Dan room. Entering the Dan room, Zuomo entered his sea of consciousness. Pu Yao was idly listening to the sound tablet. "Pu, that stars in daytime, did you cause it?" Zuomo felt his voice was trembling. "Me?" Pu Yao didn't even blink and crisply shook his head. "No." Zuomo instantly released a breath. Pu Yao might have many flaws, but he never refused to admit what he did. But Pu Yao's following words frightened Zuomo half to death. "Not me, it was you." "Me?" Zuomo pointed at his own nose and asked dumbly. "Humph, a certain dead ghost needed star energy and borrowed your body." Pu Yao was clearly laughing at his misfortunes. "At that time, I already said, he went way over." Zuomo's head was in the clouds. He stammered, "You mean, there's someone else here?" Before Pu Yao could reply, Zuomo heard someone knocking on the door. "Shixiang, the sect leader is requesting for you to go to Wukong Hall. There are guests that want to meet you." Chapter 73, Inspiration in an Emergency. Zuomo, finding inspiration in an emergency, gave a horrific wail and then collapsed on the ground. Outside the Dan room, the disciple heard Zuomo's wail and asked panicked, "Shixiang, are you all right?" There wasn't a response. Su Qing, who had been paying attention to the situation, hurriedly ran over and yelled across the door, "Shixiang, what is it? Are you all right?" There still wasn't a response from inside. Su Qing instantly became extremely worried and, disregarding that she might be scolded, opened the Dan room and saw Zuomo unconscious on the ground. Su Qing was shocked but didn't mess up. She crisply yelled at the disciple who had come to ask for Zuomo, "Go tell the sect leader." That disciple, frightened out of his wits, ran outside. In Wukong Hall, Pei Yuan ran and the others were attending to Yun Xia Xianzi's group. This group coming to visit Wukong Sword Sect really was giving face to Pei Yuan Ran and the others. Naturally, Pei Yuan Ran and the others were courteous and warm. Both guest and host were extremely amiable. So many Jindan Xiuzhe, not just in Dongfu, but even in Sky Moonjia, it was an extremely grand group of people. For the disciples that were serving at the side, other than staring with wide eyes and a gaping mouth, they felt extremely honored. Before Wei Xing had Zhuji, Wukong Sword Sect hadn't been known in Dongfu. Now, even a group of the strong masters of Bright Wave Jie had lowered themselves to visit the sect. No other sect had received such honor in Dongfu. Maybe, in all of Kunlun Jing, Bright Wave Jie wasn't anything. But it governed 31 small Jie, including Sky Moon Jie. Even the strong masters from Bright Wave Jie were so respectful to Exen Yen Shirshu. Only now did the disciples know the cold and taciturn Exen Yen Shirshu was so strong. In their eyes, their sect became even more mysterious. Conversation flowed across Wukong Sword Sect. After confirming Exen Yan's identity, Yun Xia Xianzi and the others deliberately started to attempt to win him over. They were very disappointed that Wei Xing was unable to come out of the sword cave. Not being able to meet Wei Xing, the one rumored to have created an apparition on Zhuji, It still wasn't a waste of time if they could meet the Zhuo Mo who had so many talents. For some people, like old He, their interest in Zhuo Mo far surpassed their interest in Wei Sheng. At this time, the disciple that had gone to call Zhuo Mo scrambled in. Oh no, oh no. Pei Yuan Ran's brows furrowed in dissatisfaction. He asked in a deep voice, "What are you panicked about?" Seeing the displeasure of the sect leader, the disciple was even more nervous and stammered, "Sect leader, Zhuo Mo Shixiang." Shixiang fainted. Hearing this, Shi Feng Rong suddenly stood up. "What happened?" "Say it slowly," Pei Yuan Ran shouted. His voice carried clear sound incantation. Everyone felt their minds become clear and couldn't help but mentally compliment Pei Yuan Ran on his cultivation. Suffering the shout, the mind of the outer sect disciple suddenly cleared up. His voice became clear and words simple. Zhuo Mo Shixiang had been dan-making for a few days without rest and his mind was fragile. When this disciple was reporting to Shixiang, this disciple suddenly heard a shout from the dan room. There wasn't a response when this disciple asked the next few times. Su Qing Shiji opened the door and found Shixiang unconscious on the ground. When this disciple saw him, Shixiang's complexion was terribly unwell. It must have been many days since he came out of the dan room. Hearing this, Shi Feng Rong stood. "Everyone, please excuse me." Finishing, she started to hurry towards Fragrant Ginger Yard. At this time, Pei Yuan Ran raised his hands in an apology. This one's Shimmy is worried about her disciple and lost her composure. "Please excuse her. Sect leader Pei is too serious. If our sect had such geniuses as elders, we would be the same," Boldy said. The others nodded in agreement. "Yes, your sect really has good fortune. In my sect, the disciples are average and have no great accomplishment. Every time I think of it, I cannot sit still and fears that the fires of the sect will extinguish with my generation. Then it would truly be an unpardonable crime." Yuan Li couldn't help but add. Everyone felt great empathy with Yuan Li's words. Pei Yuan Ran had a joyful expression. In the beginning, he and the others had felt the same as Yuan Li, sect leader Pei. Old He picked his words and said, "To be able to make golden crow pills just as he has started to learn dan-making, your sect's disciple has great talent in dan-making. This old man has rarely seen anything like it in these many years." He then sighed. These many years, this old man has seen many outstanding talents. Growing older, this one has found that all things are the same. With talent, one always tried to extract things from it, and this causes many geniuses to falter and die early. Their progress is troubled. Sect leader Pei needs to take great care. I had to speak my mind. If I have offended, sect leader Pei, please bear with me. Hearing this, Pei Yuan Ran was shocked. He stood and gave a deep bow to old He. The concerned words of old He, how can this one not know? This one will remember deep in the heart. Xen Yen and Yen Lu also gravely stood and made a bow towards old He. The mood of Wukong Hall became tense. Old He's words had stirred the thoughts of many people. Every sect would have some outstanding disciples, but just like old He had said, these talented disciples all had troubled fates. After such an incident had occurred, everyone didn't have the interest in conversing, and after ordering a batch of golden crow pills, they made their farewells. When Shi Feng Rong rushed back to Fragrant Ginger Yard and saw Zhuo Mo's pitiful state, she forcefully swallowed back the words of rage that had reached her mouth. But there was still barely disguised fury in her voice. "From today, for 1 month, you are not allowed to enter the dan room." Zhuo Mo grimaced inside. Not being allowed to enter the dan room for a month meant that, for a month, he didn't have any source of income. Almost all of his income right now came from making golden crow pills. The ling grasses and herbs in the ling fields, other than the kind of plants like snowy foxtail grass that could not be used in dan making, he had planned on leaving the rest of the plants for him to use. But thinking that he had temporarily managed to keep his life, Zhuo Mo felt glad inside. Facing the furious master, Zhuo Mo was very unconfident and could only mutter in agreement. Coldly glancing over Zhuo Mo, Shi Feng Rong left behind a few restorative lingdan before leaving. Zhuo Mo was very moved. Master might be of many cold words and faces, but she really was concerned about him. Before, he had felt unfortunate that he had such a foul-tempered master, but he now felt that his luck wasn't so bad. When Shifeng Rong rushed back to Wukong Hall, the guests had left. Pei Yuan Ran and the other two were sitting silently in Wukong Hall. Having been waiting for Shifeng Rong, Pei Yuan Ran repeated Old He's words to her. Shifeng Rong also had a worried expression. If it wasn't for Old He's reminder today, we have all missed this problem. Pei Yuan Ran said gravely, thinking about it now, we were truly too impatient. It was the same for Wei Sheng entering the sword cave. And it happened for Zhuo Mo's dan-making. I have already restricted him from dan-making for a month. Shifeng Rong suddenly said, this matter, it was my fault for missing it. Pei Yuan Ran waved his hand, we were all at fault. Yes. Yen Le had a regretful expression. The sales of Golden Crow Pill were too good. I got impatient because they were urging me and went to rush him. Thinking about it now, earning Jingshi is for the continued existence of the sect. If something happened to Zhuo Mo because of this matter, it really is a loss. We'd have lost a lot. It's good to restrict him from dan-making. Pei Yuan Ran said solemnly, Shidi, supervise him in this time to practice the sword. We aren't going to hope that he would make any accomplishment on the sword. His talent isn't bad in the sword, but he has too many likes, and it's hard for him to be faithful to one. If there aren't any surprises, his achievements in the sword wouldn't be as good as Wei Sheng. Everyone had achieved Jin Dan and could easily see this. Even Shifeng Rong nodded her head slightly. Zhuo Mo started out as a ling plant farmer. Then he learned dan-making followed by the sword. What he had learned was extremely broad. He wasn't willing to throw away any of it, so his achievements on the sword would most likely be very limited. But Zhuo Mo's other talents are truly outstanding. If he isn't learning dan-making with Shimmy, his talent in dan-making would be lost. We won't hope for him to cultivate the sword. We could nurture his interest in other areas, like second Shidi's forging, we could try. Pei Yuan Ran continued, but Old He's words reminded me today. Zhuo Mo's body is too weak. We might not put expectations on his sword skills, but we could strengthen his body and prevent something like becoming unconscious in the future. Before his body is strong, don't let him sink back into dan-making. Second Shidi, this will have to rely on you. Yes. Xan Yen spat out a word. In the half-lidded eyes, 2 dots of cold light flashed. No one had any opinions about Pei Yuan Ran's arrangements. Even Shifeng Rong felt that not letting Zhuo Mo sink into dan-making temporarily was a correct choice. After everyone had left, a hint of worry came onto Pei Yuan Ran's face. Zhuo Mo had a problem, then Wei Sheng? He was slightly regretful now of sending Wei Sheng into the sword cave so early. In the dark and gloomy sword cave, Wei Sheng's clothes were dyed with blood coming out of the corner of his mouth. His upper half was bare, large and small marks crisscrossing, alarming to see. Opposite to his dim and tired mental state, splitting rainbow was glowing and flashing on his hands. It was like the rainbow after the rain, the color vibrant and fresh. Wei Sheng affectionately caressed the body of the sword. The 7-colored sword hummed lightly, as though it was responding to him. In total, there were 18 levels in the sword cave. Starting from the first level, he had fought his way down step by step. The devilings along the way, he hadn't let go of even one. There wasn't any slacking or tricks. Even though he already knew that Void Sword Scripture was on the 18th level, if he could reach the 18th level, he would be able to see the greatest art the sect founder had left behind, Void Sword Scripture. But he controlled the impulse in his heart. Steady step by steady step, one deviling after the next, he forged his sword essence. He was the very first second-generation disciple in Wukong sword sect to comprehend sword essence, even earlier than Zhuo Mo. He had naturally comprehended it at Zhuji. The sword essence he had comprehended by himself, it wasn't from any kind of sword scripture, but from his daily continuous fights, his own understandings which formed his own sword essence. His sword essence, it wasn't an understanding of the sword scriptures, but an understanding of the sword. This was also why Xan Yen found it troublesome and hard to teach him. This was also why, no matter if it was the stubborn Xan Yen or the steady Pei Yuan Ran, they were all in favor of sending him to the sword cave. They had high expectations of him. Wei Xing, who had his own sword essence, he wasn't just the person in the sect most likely to grasp void sword scripture, but the only one with hopes of reaching the level that the founder had attained. Even though Zhuo Mo had comprehended sword essence, but in the hearts of the elders, Wei Xing's talents at the sword was much higher than him. Wei Xing gently caressed the sword, his eyes resolute. His cultivation had rose furiously and in a short amount of time, reached the 8th level of Zhuji. But what he didn't know was that, of the past disciples that entered the sword cave, those that could enter the 8th level, none of them were below Ningmai. And him, just with his Zhuji cultivation, fought and killed his way to the 16th level. Starting from the 13th level, every step that he took, he needed to pay a price. But he didn't become afraid and retreat. His sword, there was no retreat, there was no hesitation. Chapter 74, Nightmares. Zhuo Mo wasn't get upset when he was restricted from Dan making for a month. To escape from imminent life-threatening danger or to make Dan for a month, it wasn't a difficult choice to make. However, when informed that his ban would be endlessly extended by his master until he satisfactorily completed Xen Yen Sherbua's exercise training, Zhuo Mo became dumbstruck. To meet with the visiting Jindan masters was a calamity, and to receive Xen Yen Sherbua's torture was another calamity. If Zhuo Mo had a choice, he would unhesitatingly choose the first calamity. He didn't know the strength of those Jindan masters, but he had directly experienced Xen Yen Sherbua's strength. He now knew what being too smart for your own good was. Master, who had always pushed him to make Dan, had suddenly reversed her position and sent down a strict order for him to go to Xen Yen Sherbua for special training. Before she left, she had sternly warned him, if he dishonored her in front of Xen Yen Sherbua, when she came back, it was humph humph. Master's humph humph was almost as scary as second Sherbua's terrifying stare. Master had never explained what her humph humph really was, but the smile that accompanied each humph humph caused Zhuo Mo to shiver and his hair raise up. Certain that he was marching into the jaws of death, Zhuo Mo went to Xen Yen Sherbua's grass hut. On the way there, he warned Pu Yao countless times. Pu Yao definitely was one to hold grudges. Second Sherbua had attacked him. With this guy's ungenerous attitude, he was definitely thinking of getting revenge. Pu Yao was arrogant and wanted to reclaim his honor, saying that it was because he had been previously wounded that he had been defeated by Second Sherbua. Zhuo Mo was celebrating the fact that Pu Yao hadn't recovered from his wounds yet, otherwise, he definitely would be making another mess. Didn't he know that this was a different era? After the incident with the Yin bead, Zhuo Mo had no fear of Pu Yao anymore. What Sky Yao? It was clearly an old antique that was still living in the time 3,000 years ago, and completely cut off from the present. So pitiful. Sometimes, Zhuo Mo couldn't help but pity Pu Yao. From what he saw, Pu Yao was clearly still living in the illusions of the past, and didn't want to face the cruel reality. Anyone who had been imprisoned for 3,000 years, they would probably behave the same way when they came out. Zhuo Mo thought that the incident of the Yin beads had dealt a great blow to Pu Yao. This Ren Yao had been dispirited for quite a few days. Afterwards, Pu Yao had offered many other things that could be used to make money, but Zhuo Mo had sympathetically yet resolutely rejected them. Regardless of sympathy, in order to avoid trouble, Zhuo Mo sternly warned Pu Yao. Zhuo Mo had initially used Second Sherbua to threaten him, but seeing that there wasn't an effect, he immediately changed to using the threat of Jingshi. That was instantly effective. Pu Yao was a great consumer of Jingshi. Zhuo Mo didn't know how Pu Yao could use up so much Jingshi. But clearly, Pu Yao had at least an additional source of consumption, going to the sword cave. Pu Yao was extremely desirous of Yin energy, and in this area, only the sword cave had it. Zhuo Mo found that he had the feeling that he was raising a pet. Coming to the sunset lookout peak for the second time, the sword essences in the ground surrounding the grass hut seemed to recognize him and had completely disappeared. Second Sherbua. He shouted. Come in. Second Sherbua's icy words came out from behind the wooden door. Zhuo Mo seemed to see, behind the wooden door, Second Sherbua sitting in the lotus position, his body as large as a mountain, casting a shadow over him. Feeling weak and fragile, he barely raised his head and was only being able to see a pair of indifferent and frigid eyes staring at him. Zuermo couldn't help but shudder. He forced himself to throw away his delusions and calmed his mind. He pushed open the door and gathered his bravery to walk in. Sit. Second Sherbwa didn't open his eyes. Just like last time, he was sitting on a meditation mat. The sunlight came in through a hole in the roof and landed on his body. Zuermo saw the meditation mat in front of Second Sherbwa and carefully sat down, lowering his head and listening hard. Starting from today, I will teach you. Xen Yen Sherbwa's body was thin and withered, but sitting there with closed eyes, he seemed to weigh 1,000 caddies, suppressing Zuermo so much he almost couldn't breathe. He didn't speak in a loud voice, but when it landed in Zuermo's ears, it was like thunder. Yes. Zuermo weakly responded. Even now, he didn't understand why Master and the sect leaders suddenly thought of throwing him to Second Sherbwa. Our sect cultivates the sword and doesn't put importance on the body. But your natural body is weak and lacking. So you must start from the physical body. Xen Yen Sherbwa didn't open his eyes, yet a strong presence was carried with his light words. It announced the beginning of Zuermo's tragic life. The mountain slopes of Wukong Mountain wasn't steep, but because of the winding mountain path, it took almost 6 hours to climb up on foot. The outer sect disciples of Wukong Sword Sect had suddenly found that Zuermo Shixiang would walk on the mountain path, panting heavily, sweat running down his back as he went up and down. A few days later, a backpack appeared on Zuermo Shixiang's back. It was still up and down. Looking at Shixiang struggling up the mountain path, some outer sect disciples wanted to help but were sworn at by Zuermo Shixiang. All the outer sect disciples were puzzled. Was Shixiang masochistic? Each day, Zuermo wanted to cry. He didn't have the patience to treat others politely. Far away, standing at the highest point on the mountain, Xen Yen Shixiang was supervising him. Zuermo didn't dare to slack off even the slightest bit. Such a stupid method. Your trash of a Sherbwa is actually using such a dumb method. Pu Yao laughed continuously at his misfortunes. Zuermo gritted his teeth and raised his legs. His entire body was covered in sweat. Every time his bare foot touched the stone stairs, it would leave behind a wet footprint. He didn't pay attention to Pu Yao. He wasn't afraid that Second Sherbwa would find out, but because he didn't have the energy to talk. Now that he was thinking of those body cultivators, he asked himself, why didn't he think of cultivating the body? Each step he took, he could barely make it. If he stopped to rest it at all, it meant that this round was wasted, and that he would face a multiplied punishment. Second Sherbwa's eyes were really terrifying, to be able to see so clearly from that far away. Every time he thought about it, he would wail inside. Second Sherbwa, do you really have the free time to guarding a little character like me every day? Isn't it unprofitable? Don't you need to meditate, cultivate the sword, forge something? Do you want me to teach you a body cultivation art? Pu Yao snickered. Speaking of body cultivation, Mo are the true masters. Those in your Xiozha that cultivate the body, you all learned it completely from the Mo, but you really didn't copy it well. As the true allies of the Mo, I have a profound inheritance of body cultivation. Includes teaching and learning, would be beneficial for a lifetime, definitely without side effects. Zuermo was too lazy to respond to him. He bared his teeth, used all the energy in his body to move upwards step by step. Pu Yao laughed even more merrily. At the top of the eastern peak, Xiaogua watched Zuermo Shixiang struggle up the winding mountain path. Her heart was deeply moved. She tightened her pink fists, determination written on her apple face. Shixiang is so strong yet so hardworking. Xiaogua needs to work harder. She turned and left, deciding to multiply her practice time today. If Zuermo knew of Xiaogua's thoughts, he would definitely wail to the heavens, Gu is being forced. In reality, his mind was entirely blank. After the energy was used up, a person's reaction times and thoughts would become slower. The second half of the ascent, it was completely instinctive. Zuermo couldn't even distinguish what Pu Yao was saying. When he finally reached the mountaintop, without a word, Second Sherbwa picked him up and flew to fragrant ginger yard. In the yard, a large wooden tub had been set up over a large metal pot. The wooden tub was filled with a black liquid. The smell of herbs could be detected a long way off. Su Qing was standing next to the wooden tub. Seeing second Sherbois holding Zua Mo, she hurriedly lit the fire. Without a word, Xen Yen Sherbois threw Zua Mo carelessly into the wooden tub before floating away. Splash! Like a ball of mud, Zua Mo accurately landed in the wooden tub. The hot medicine bath made his pupils shrink and he inhaled sharply. At the side, Su Qing's face reddened slightly and then she said sympathetically to Zua Mo, "Shixiang, today's medicine bath costs 1 piece of third-grade jingsher. The master said that it will be put on the accounts and for you to pay back in time." Zua Mo's expression was fierce and twisted as he nodded. It really was too hot. He needed to pay for the medicine bath each day. They were really too miserly. Wasn't this forcing him to owe debts? But after the last few days, Zua Mo knew it was useless to rebel and could only grit his teeth and accept it. Additionally, the effect of these medicine baths were extremely evident. If he didn't have it, Zua Mo certainly couldn't finish the amount of training that second Sherbois assigned. Then he would have to face an even more terrifying punishment. Sometimes, Zua Mo had the feeling that second Sherbois and master were in cahoots. Su Qing was even more sympathetic as she reminded Zua Mo, "Shixiang, I need to increase the fire." A short while later, wails like pigs being slaughtered echoed through fragrant ginger yard. The female disciples that were working at the front of the yard all sympathetically turned to look and exchanged glances before sighing, "Really pitiful." Then they buried their heads to continue their own work. After the medicine bath, Zua Mo seemed to sleepwalk back to the little west wind yard. The nightmare of the day finally ended. He wanted to drop and sleep. The bones in his body seemed to want to collapse, but he still forced himself to meditate in the rock room. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation didn't do anything special for the recovery of his body, but for nurturing the mind, it was very effective. Zua Mo was suspicious. If he didn't have embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, he might not die from exhaustion, but he would first go insane from exhaustion. He entered meditation extremely quickly. Time also flew quickly. When he opened his eyes, his body was still sore, but the feeling that his mind was blank had disappeared. It felt that he could control his body again. The medicine bath had been prepared by master. Supposedly, the more exhausted he was, the more effectively the medicine would nurture the muscles. With a hint of reluctance and helplessness, he stood. What he needed to do now was get to Sunset Lookout Peak before sunrise. If he was late, it would be very bad. At this time, the sky hadn't lightened and was a patch of black. The mountain paths were still cold. The night sky above his head, Zua Mo flew towards Sunset Lookout Peak, the stars above him mischievously shining. Sprinting in the wind, Zua Mo only had one thought: this nightmare, please end quickly. He wanted to go back to his previous life of farming and dam-making. Even practicing the sword in the river was much better than this. Right now, he was counting the days on his hand. And what made him despair the most was what master had said before leaving: only when second Sherbois was satisfied. Second Sherbois satisfied? He had countless reasons to believe, in the eyes of the terrifying second Sherbois, this was just the beginning. Just as Zua Mo was living through a tragic life, a shocking incident happened in Dongfu and Dongfu shook. Before, they had assumed that it was only one wounded Yaoma, so no one had treated it seriously. With the power of so many Jindan masters, wouldn't it have been easy to exterminate one injured Yaoma? No one could have predicted that the situation would have changed so quickly. It was basically impossible to conceal the matter of the stars in daytime. Large numbers of Xiozha had hoped to hunt and kill the Yaoma and had furiously gathered in Sky Moonjia. A wounded high-grade Yaoma meant countless Jingshi and countless talismans. There are actually Xiozha that have allied with the Yaoma. When Tai Sanren was furious, Ulti raised his head and said, "Why couldn't it be a group of Yaoma?" Once the words came out, the enormous Dongfu Hall fell silent. Yun Xia Xianzi tiredly went back to her residence. Xiao Huan, seeing her mistress' expression, said with concern and terror, "Miss, why don't we leave? The matters here are very frightening." Yun Xia grimaced, "How can we leave now? If we don't conclude this matter, we will let down the deceased Mr. Yuan." Xiao Huan bit her lips and said resolutely, "Then I will go find Yin beads for Miss. If Miss has a few more Yin thunder beads, then there's no need to fear them." "Silly girl." Yun Xia patted Xiao Hun's head and said affectionately, "Getting a bargain the first one, how can you think you will get the bargain every time? In any case, I can't help Miss otherwise." Xiao Huan's eyes became misty. The two might formally be master and servant, but in reality they were like sisters. "Your Miss isn't that weak. At the least, I'm a Jin Dan." Yun Xia hurriedly comforted Xiao Huan, but she was unconfident inside. Old He's words circled in her heart. She knew that the situation in Blood Sky Metropolis Jia was worsening, but didn't know how bad it actually was. If the Yaoma had really infiltrated Sky Moon Jia, then how bad was the situation in Blood Sky Metropolis Jia? At some unknown time, a drizzle of rain had started falling outside the room. Looking at the faraway mountains enveloped in the rain, the haze in Yun Xia Xianzi's heart was just as heavy. Zuoremo had been correct. His tragic life had just started. Old He's good-intentioned reminder combined with Zuomo's clever feinting, it had alarmed Pei Yuan Ran and the others. Only geniuses who were alive were able to become true masters. In the eyes of Pei Yuan, Shifeng Rong and the others, Zuomo didn't lack for talent. More so, they thought that Zuomo still had hidden talents that were waiting to be discovered. However, his fragile body limited his development. Dying prematurely was something that was likely to befall him. In comparison, Wei Xing was almost too strong in this area and didn't need their concern at all. Pei Yuan Ran and the others, after being advised, found that their initial thoughts were incorrect. For someone as multi-talented as Zuoremo, it wasn't important to cultivate the sword, it was important for him to keep his life. Rather than nurture him into an average sword cultivator, it was much better to make him an extremely healthy turtle. The upper levels of Wukong sword sect sank into simultaneous reflection. Consequently, Xen Yen personally stepped forward. From this, it was possible to see how important Wukong sword sect thought Zuomo was. After the nightmarish cultivation, Zuomo's body had improved. Even though it still appeared thin, but there was some more muscles on his bones. Under the double influence of intense training and the medicinal liquid, he had gradually gotten used to the body cultivation. It was a pity that Zuomo didn't understand what his master and the other Shibo were thinking. Xen Yen Shibo personally teaching him, shocked and pained him at the same time. In all the elders, Xen Yen was the strictest and the one Zuoremo was afraid of the most. How good would it be if it had been Yen Lu Shibo? Zuoremo couldn't help but fantasize sometimes. In the grass hut, Xen Yen threw a jade scroll at Zuoremo and led him to a valley in the back of the mountain. Zuoremo had came to this valley before. It evidently had just been flattened and there was an eye-catching seal formation at the bottom of the valley. Without a second word, he threw Zuoremo into the seal formation. "Shibo, what is this?" Zuoremo asked, slightly panicked. Xen Yen Shibo didn't pay attention to him and floated away. Zuoremo looked in alarm at the surroundings. However, as nothing happened, his heart slowly calmed. Was this some body-strengthening seal formation? Such a good thing, why didn't they take it out earlier? For a while, nothing happened. However, Zuoremo didn't dare to run out of the seal formation of his own accord. Shibo had thrown him in. If he ran out, the outcome would be bad. So he started to look at the jade scroll that Shibo gave him. There was a body cultivation scripture in the jade scroll. It was called Vajra Profound Sutra. Zuoremo was slightly shocked. From the name, it didn't look like one of the sect's scriptures, but more like the scriptures of Diana Cultivators. Where did Shibo get this? During his 2 years in the outer sect, he suffered through hardships trying to gather jade scrolls. Zuoremo held a special fondness for jade schools that recorded new things. This time he didn't need to spend contribution points to get this scroll. Zuoremo finally felt that he hadn't suffered for nothing. Curious, he kept on reading. As expected, it was a Diana Shio scripture. The scriptures of Diana Shio were mostly simple and their demands on personal talent were the lowest. However, what they demanded of determination and personality was much higher. This scripture was the same. There wasn't many complex parts, but what it needed was constancy. If this would be constantly cultivated, the body would be like gold metal, and if one could comprehend, the final level would be forming the Vajrapani's indestructible body. Of course, Zhuo snorted at that. These days, no matter what jade scroll, they would always talk about how strong they were. It was the same as Pu Yao always labeling himself a Sky Yao. However, what Zhuo found interesting was Vajra Profound Sutra mentioned that the body would not be easily wounded. No matter what the circumstances, the most important was to stay alive. If it would be somewhat mastered, Yao Ma would be unable to approach near him, and nothing evil would be able to infiltrate. Zhuo suddenly found what he was learning was more and more varied. This kind of second-hand item, he's not ashamed to take it out. Pu Yao somehow came out and said with a face full of disdain. Second-hand. Zhuo raised the jade scroll in his hand. Do you have it? I only keep the finest. Pu Yao said proudly. Like the yin bead? Zhuo smirked. Pu Yao was like a deflated balloon. The incident of the yin beads had become Zhuo's most effective weapon. Pu Yao didn't have any room to argue. But when he looked at the seal formation surrounding them, he started to snicker. Zhuo's heart started to feel unconfident and couldn't resist asking, "What are you laughing about?" Pu Yao's crimson-red eye held a strange laughter at Zhuo's misfortunes. Zhuo was very familiar with this expression. He had seen this expression too many times recently. Zhuo couldn't help but feel something was wrong. Have a good time. Pu Yao was full of smugness as he went back into Zhuo's consciousness. Zhuo felt even more unconfident. Looking at the seals surrounding him, his heart trembled. Maybe this seal formation wasn't a body-strengthening seal formation? At this time, suddenly a faint mist formed in the surroundings. Zhuo saw it clearly. The mist had been created by the seal formation. He instantly became nervous. Was it about to begin? The mist quickly spread. He couldn't see in front of him and became even more cautious. A sword energy suddenly came out of the mist and shot at him. Zhuo, already on the defense, sliced out with his hand, a sword energy leaving and accurately hitting the sword energy that was flying at him. Ping! A light flashed and the two sword energies destroyed each other. Before Zhuo could react, hiss, two other sword energies came out of the mist. Zhuo didn't dare to drop his defenses and flung out two sword energies. Hiss. 4 sword energies came at him from different directions. He dodged left and weaved right, an extremely sorry figure. The sword energies increased in number at an astounding speed, so fast that Zhuo couldn't react. When the sword energy entered his body, the needling pain caused Zhuo to howl. Zhuo finally understood what this damned seal formation was. Chapter 76, Body Cultivating Sword Formation. A sword formation. This was actually a sword formation. Damn it, why did Sherba throw him into a sword formation? Zhuo suddenly thought of the jade scroll in his hand. If the muscles on his face weren't paralyzed, his expression right now would be deathly pale. Body cultivation. To use a sword formation to cultivate the body, which bastard thought of this idea? Zhuo wanted to kill them. He wasn't dumb. Actually, when he had thought of the Vajra Profound Sutra on his hands, he instantly understood. These sword energies were extremely small and non-fatal, but they were exceptionally painful when they hit him. Hard for a normal flying sword to wound. Zhuo suddenly thought of the phrase and his little heart shook. Was it necessary to first be pierced by countless flying swords to create a thick skin and then cultivate the hard to be wounded by flying swords? He almost fainted at the idea. However, he felt that this idea was probably the truth. In the first wave of swords, Zhuo had been struck 7 times. It was so painful he howled. Thankfully, the sword formation gave him time to breathe. The mist gradually dissipated, yet Zhuo didn't relax at all. He quickly took out Vajra Profound Sutra. If he didn't guess wrong, the next storm of swords would be coming in a short while. Xn Yen Sherba's habits were like his sword, he wouldn't give people time to rest. Unfortunately, Zhuo had guessed right. Just as he read a bit of the contents, the second storm of swords started. With no attention to spare for anything else, he suddenly jumped up and the sword energies left continuously from his hand. Even though he had comprehended sword essence, He was still struck 12 times during the second wave. This time, he didn't make a sound. Inside, he repeatedly cursed Sherbwa and unhesitatingly started Vajra Profound Sutra. If he didn't successfully do one round of Vajra Profound Sutra before the third sword storm came, he would just be ripe pickings. He almost couldn't deal with the second wave of swords. 12 strikes. The pain reached his bones. Thankfully, the language of Vajra Profound Sutra was straightforward and simple to practice. Before the third wave arrived, Zwa Emo finally completed one round of the Vajra Profound Sutra. A faint gold color appeared on his skin. Before he could admire himself, the third wave of swords silently arrived. Like the rain hitting the leaves, the pia-pia rang out in his ears. As expected, the pain lessened. However, this wave of swords were much denser than the last two waves. Zwa Emo might have the Vajra scripture but was still dumbstruck. He didn't know how many times he was hit. In a daze, he could only hear Pu Yao's extremely happy roars of laughter. When Xen Yen Sherbwa carried a swollen Zwa Emo back to the Little West Wind Yard, the outer sect disciples along the way that saw the scene all had the same expression. Zwa Emo Shixiang is very pitiful. After they had seen Zwa Emo abuse himself on the mountain roads every day, they didn't find it strange anymore. Of course, there were still rumors. Like Zwa Emo Shixiang had offended Xen Yen Shirshu, so Xen Yen Shirshu was exceptionally angry and was personally administering punishment. Or that Zwa Emo Shixiang was practicing a kind of legendary art. This legendary art was exceptionally cruel and that the female disciples in Fragrant Ginger Yard could prove it. When Zwa Emo had finally recovered in his own little yard, what welcomed him was the sympathetic gaze of the gray-beaked goose on the rooftop. Zwa Emo climbed up self-mockingly. He finally could rest for a few days. Before leaving, Sherbwa had said that he would come back in 5 days. Clearly, the sword formation was not suited to being used every day. He also needed time to practice Vajra Profound Sutra. If he didn't improve before next time, he would die a terrible death. Vajra Profound Sutra had a slight healing effect. After practicing it for a little while, Zwa Emo felt his entire body had become warm. This shocked him slightly. In the scriptures he had practiced before, the most comfortable was embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. It was hard to describe the feeling of void. The feelings this time wasn't as enchanting as cultivating embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, but for Zwa Emo, who was presently wounded, the warm feeling was actually more appropriate. Also, because it was easier to learn, there were no bottlenecks in Vajra Profound Sutra. It wasn't like embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, which always made him spit blood. After practicing for 4 hours, Zwa Emo's entire body was amazingly relaxed. The marks on his body had also faded. Zwa Emo was overjoyed. He went to the ling fields inside the valley and felt heartache as he looked at the ling grasses in the fields. He hadn't taken care of the fields for quite a few days. Some of the more sensitive plants seemed slightly wilted. Zwa Emo gritted his teeth and harvested all those ling grasses that were sensitive and near maturity. He decided to sell all of them. The remaining ling grasses were hardier plants. It was rare for Sherbwa to have mercy. With a vacation of 5 days, Zwa Emo could finally take a breath. Even though he knew that the reprieve was temporary and he would once again enter the nightmare after 5 days, he still planned on enjoying these 5 days. Listening to the sound tablet, Zwa Emo hummed a little tune, his head on his arms as he looked at the jade scrolls that Elder Wei Nan had left. As soon as he relaxed, he couldn't help but think of making jingsher. There was no way around it. After soaking in the medicine baths every day, he was in the midst of a great amount of debt and owed Master a lot of jingsher. And now that he was restricted from the Dan room, he couldn't make the Golden Crow pill and had no income. Not only that, he also couldn't make any progress on the new Ling Dan. He suddenly thought of the water method that had been mentioned in Elder Wei Nan's Jade Scrolls. The number of ways to make Dan in the world could not be counted. The fire method was the most widespread, and methods involving water and wood were more esoteric. Elder Wei Nan's knowledge was broad and he was extremely skilled at using whatever was available in the environment to create the greatest value. Zwa Emo admired this very much. In many cases, a person's circumstances would have all kinds of limitations, and those limits could not be changed. To use disadvantageous circumstances to create good results was undoubtedly an area worthy of deep study. There was a cold spring in the rock room. It was acceptable for the water method. Most of the dan that could be made by the water method leaned towards the yin and the cold. This was a limit of the water method. But for Zhuemo, he didn't have any other choice. There were many dan recipes involving the water method in the scrolls of Elder Wei Nan. Zhuemo scanned through and picked a few dan that he could make now, noting down what was needed. It seemed that he needed to go to Dongfu. Even though he had heavy debts, but he didn't need to pay them off immediately, so Zhuemo still had some jingshe in his pocket. If he sold the ling grasses, which he wasn't planning on letting the sect sell for him, he would get some more jingshe. He only had 5 days of vacation. It would take too long if the sect sold it, and no one could know that he had gone to Dongfu to buy materials. If Master knew he was secretly making dan, Master's humph would probably start taking effect. As to the outcome, he didn't need to even think about it. Disguising his appearance and concealing his tracks, Zhuemo had become familiar with doing both. The effects of the recent training were extremely evident. Zhuemo flew as he walked, and no longer resembled the weak zombie of the past. He changed his appearance this time to a mundane-looking man. He was very familiar with Dongfu. The quality of the ling grasses he had wasn't the best, but since he was a ling plant farmer, it was still much better than what normal cultivators could grow, so they sold very quickly. He then brought some of the raw materials for the water method. After finishing what he needed to do, his mind relaxed as he started to wander around. Xiao Huan's expression was panicked. She spent every day guarding the free market, waiting for the person that had sold her the yin beads. After some time, she rented a stall, and after paying a high price, she hung up a sign, purchasing yin beads at high prices. She believed, if that waxy-looking man saw the sign, he would come find her. She had been frightened by Miss encountering dangers. When she found out that Miss had only survived due to the yin bead that she had brought the last time, she knew how to help Mississippi. If she could buy a few more yin beads, and Miss could forge more yin thunder beads, then she wouldn't have to worry so much. She regretted very much that she hadn't brought more the first time. She stood guard every day, but she never encountered the yellow-skinned man. She couldn't help but look at a nearby stall. The stall owner was a youth. His sign was also, buying yin beads at high price. Xiao Huan was irritated. She recognized the youth. He was a disciple of Wentai Sanren. Many people had seen misuse the yin thunder bead, and the origins of the yin bead wasn't a secret. It wasn't just Yun Xia that knew how to make yin thunder beads. The method of making yin beads had been lost long ago, but the method of making yin thunder beads wasn't hard to find. Additionally, yin beads wasn't just limited to making yin thunder beads. 3,000 years ago, there had been a sect called Deviling's sect which had specialized in making yin beads. Of the various beads that could be made from yin beads, there were also yin thunder beads and yin fire beads as well as others. But the most famous of the Deviling's sect was the Nine Heaven Devilings formation. The Nine Heaven Devilings formation, it was formed using 3,600 beads of various kinds to form the formation. This was a terrifying formation that could even kill Fanshu cultivators. In the past, other than selling yin beads, the Devilings sect would also sell already made beads as well as simple spells to make them. So things like the yin thunder bead had spread out. Due to the power of the yin thunder bead and the ease of making them, many shoujo would always have some. In the Great Battle 3,000 years ago, the entire Devilings sect had nearly been exterminated. The method of making the yin beads had been lost, but the method of making the yin thunder bead had been passed on. In reality, other than Wentai Sanren, the others were also trying to buy yin beads. But the others were not as straightforward as Wentai Sanren. They hired locals to buy yin beads. Xiao Huan was especially irritated when she saw Wentai Sanren's disciples' disdainful attitude towards her. Shameless! She cursed for the nth time, but because the others' cultivation was higher than her, she couldn't do anything. It naturally aroused the attentions of all the powers in the free market when a large group of people who wanted to buy yin beads appeared. No matter how much they asked, they still didn't know what yin beads were. Some brave fellows took some beads to make forgeries of een beads. The result was they were beaten until they were crippled. After a few days, the local snakeheads knew that this group wasn't easy to deal with, and so no one tried again. So when Zwa wandered to the free market and saw a continuous forest of signs saying buying een beads at high prices, he was instantly dumbstruck. Chapter 77 Plot. Zwa stared dazedly at the patches of signs in the free market. Pu Yao's countenance was extremely smug and arrogant, the depression over the recent failure sweeping away as he said, "See, I said so. Een beads are very valuable." Zwa gradually regained his focus. As he swept his gaze across the market, he saw the little girl that had brought een beads from him the previously. The little girl seemed quite panicked. Did she need the een beads desperately? Zwa couldn't help but speculate inside. The little girl had been very kind, so Zwa had a good impression of her. It appeared that the een beads were useful. Last time, when the little girl had come, she had only brought one out of kindness. At that time, she probably didn't recognize een beads. Zwa ruminated about selling them. Zwa didn't pay attention to Pu Yao. Walking in front of the little girl, he said, "You're buying een beads?" Pamani. Just at this time, Pu Yao suddenly said in a grave tone, "Run." Zwa paused. Who would have thought that this little town of Dongfu was concealing so much? Even something that has been lost for so long, like een beads, also appeared, a slightly piercing voice said reflectively. The person who spoke was the yellow-robed Taoist. "Yes. I was also very surprised when I learned about it," the silver-clad man said, a flash of puzzlement running through his eyes. "The Deviling sect has been dead for so many years, how can a successor have appeared?" "It's not easy guessing about a sect's succession." The yellow-robed Taoist's eyes followed the silver-clad male closely. "Why do you not find someone else?" The silver-clad male's expression was normal. "The others? They can't do it." The yellow-robed Taoist smiled smugly. "Exactly. Except for you and I, the others are only average. They cannot do anything and will ruin things." "Are you sure that the person who is selling the een beads will definitely appear?" "I am not sure." The silver-clad male shook his head. The yellow-robed Taoist's expression changed. His pupils suddenly shrank. "You are making fun of me?" The silver-clad male was not affected. "I've shared the information with you. If you do not find it useful, you can leave. The method of making the een beads, it is worthy of you waiting a while." The yellow-robed Taoist stared at the silver-clad male for a long while before suddenly laughing. "You're right. The Deviling sect was so famous in the past, what they relied on wasn't just the way to make een beads. Ha ha, if I can find this person, all of the techniques of the Deviling sect would land in our hands. Don't be happy this early," the silver-clad male said. "There are probably many that have the same idea as us." "Humph. They dare to steal from me. They are courting death." The yellow-robed Taoist icily said. "It's best to be careful. Even those people from Bright Wave Jie were ambushed and one was killed." The brow of the silver-clad male furrowed. He felt extremely puzzled by that incident. Even though he had said clever words, but he was still extremely wary of the group from Bright Wave Jie. Additionally, he had needed Yuan Li to find the Yaoma. He was very clear about Yuan Li's abilities, but no one could have thought that Yuan Li would die in an ambush that had ruined his arrangements. Who was it that had killed Yuan Li? This ambush, which had a clearly targeted Yuan Li, had instantly turned everything into a mess. Now that Yuan Li had been killed, his sect definitely would be angry. The branch of the Master of Bright Wave Jie would not tolerate this kind of action. If this situation dragged on, there would definitely be large numbers of high-level Xiozha that would arrive and complicate the situation. If that happened, then he would lose the chance to benefit from this incident. He had reacted extremely quickly and changed direction when he had seen a shift. The news that Yun Xia Xinzi had relied on a een thunder bead to escape the ambush had spread through Dongfu. The attentions of many people had been aroused, including himself. Just at this time, he made a sound, and his eyes were looking at a male standing in front of a stall. "What?" The yellow-robed Taoist became alert. "Did you find something?" "He seems to have arrived." The silver-clad male stared at the average-looking man. "Him." Following the eyes of the silver-clad male, the yellow-robed Taoist also looked at Zhuo Mo that was in front of Xiao Huan's stall. A little guy with a cultivation of Zhuji, that's not likely. The gaze of the silver-clad male didn't move, as he informed. That little girl is the maid of Yun Xia Xianzi. Last time, it was her that bought the yin beads. There are so many stalls in the market, but that person didn't go to anyone else but straight to hers. It's suspicious. It really is suspicious. By this time, the yellow-robed Taoist also understood, and the glimmer of greed flashed in his eyes. It wasn't just the two of them that had noticed this. Just as Zhuo Mo went to leave, a young person appeared behind him. Do you want to sell yin beads? Why don't you sell to me and we can negotiate the price? Zhuo Mo, who had received Pu Yao's warning, instantly noticed the many gazes that had gathered on his person. He became alarmed and knew that the situation was dangerous. It was a good thing that the yin beads could be sold for a good price, but if he had to pay with his life in the process, then he wasn't willing. I don't have yin beads. Seeing the situation, Zhuo Mo quickly pretended to be ignorant. I just noticed that you guys have been putting up stalls here for many days and was curious. What sort of treasure is this yin bead? How much is it worth? Do you have an example? Can you let me take a look? If I encounter it, I wouldn't pass on a chance to get rich. Really? The young person smiled coldly. Then why didn't you come ask me, but went straight to her? Xiao Huan couldn't resist anymore. Her brows raising, she said angrily, the one named Shui, what do you mean? Why can't he come to this lady's stall? This youth was Wen Tai Sanren's disciple. He was called Shui Yun. Xiao Huan always found him to be an eyesore. This one doesn't mean to suggest anything, Shui Yun smirked icily. This one is only working on behalf of my master. Something as good as yin beads, they can't all go to one person. Zhuo Mo gave a smile. You must have misunderstood. I don't have yin beads. The young man had a cultivation of Ningmai and wasn't someone that a little Zhuji cultivator could battle against. Zhuo Mo wasn't dumb. He understood that, if he really took out the yin beads right now, then he really would die. He definitely wouldn't get yin beads, and the other certainly would try to force out the spell to form yin beads. Otherwise, he wouldn't be let go. Don't have yin beads? Shui Yun snorted. That will have to be determined after I search you. Xiao Huan stood resolutely in front of Zhuo Mo and said angrily, you dare. She wasn't stupid. If Shui Yun hadn't come, she might not have recognized Zhuo Mo, but Shui Yun's behavior made her look closely. She found that, while this person's appearance was different, but his figure was similar to the person from last time. Shui Yun looked disdainfully at Xiao Huan. You're just a maid. Do you think yourself important? Finishing, he didn't look at Xiao Huan and strode towards Zhuo Mo. Zhuo Mo saw that the situation could not be resolved, and thought that with his pitiful and weak speed, even if he were to run, he would most likely be unsuccessful. He really had bad luck today. Zhuo Mo grimaced inside. As expected, it was risky trying to make Jingshi like this, and he needed to be cautious. Looking at Shui Yun, who seemed extremely certain, Zhuo Mo's eyes darkened. Murderous intent was rising inside. The other's cultivation far surpassed his, and he didn't think he could win even with trickery. Noticing the confidence on the young man's face, he decided to give the other a little surprise. His eyes staring fixedly at Shui Yun, the Ling energy in his body moved furiously. He was waiting for Shui Yun to come near, and what would welcome Su Yu would be Zhuo Mo's strongest sword attack. Li water burning heavens. Just at this time, suddenly someone interrupted, ha. No wonder Wen Tai Sanren isn't respected. It can be understood from seeing his disciple. Shui Yun's expression instantly changed. His eyes darkened, he stopped in his steps and shouted loudly, who is this? Your words are really frightening. Why do you hide? Do you not dare to come out? Just someone like you, are you enough for ye to come out? The voice was faint and one could not locate the source. Shui Yun's expression finally changed, and there was shock in his eyes. He had focused on listening just now but still couldn't find where the voice came from. This meant that the other's cultivation was much higher than his. While Shui Yun was in shock, a figure suddenly leapt at Zhuo Mo. You dare. Several shouts sounded out simultaneously. Swords flashed and several bright lights could be seen as flying swords flew at the figure. All of these people were all highly skilled. Although their target wasn't him, the sharp sword essence inside the sword energy was enough to make Zhuo Mo's skin hurt. He was extremely shocked inside. Only now did he realize that the nondescript Yin bead had such a shockingly high value. Pu Yao did have something valuable in his possession. At such a dangerous time, such a nonsensical thought had floated through Zhuo Mo's mind. There were thousands of sword energies that formed a net, but they didn't harm Zhuo Mo one bit. The cultivation of the figure wasn't normal either. A faint green flying sword flashed and formed a net of light in front of him, barely stopping the other flying swords. The figure suddenly disappeared from his spot. Being alone, he naturally wasn't a match for the group. Just as everyone was attacking this person, a dark red rope was silently nearing Zhuo Mo. The silver-clad male was the first to find it. He snorted icily, wanting to take advantage of the fight. It won't be that easy. He pointed with a hand and a silver light struck the dark red rope. The dark red rope wasn't an average grade talisman. Like a wave, the dark red rope fluttered and then dissipated the silver light. The silver-clad male didn't waste words. His silver-hooked sword turned into an extremely thin silver light, and like a snake climbing a tree, circled and constricted around the dark red rope. The yellow-robed Taoist and the figure who had leapt at Zhuo Mo were engaged in battle with each other. The figure seemed to be shrouded in a ball of smoke. No one could clearly see his appearance. The shape of his body changed rapidly. The yellow-robed Taoist evidently was taking the fight seriously. The yellow-gold flying sword was like a sun streaking in the sky. The light radiating from it was blinding. Each move was large and vast, extremely powerful. No one was able to approach near Zhuo Mo and Xiao Huan. The pitiful Shui Yun had instantly been sliced by these swords into minced meat. Xiao Huan's face was pale and she was dazed as she looked at the sky. Those sword energies and talismans, she almost couldn't stand under their presence. At this time, she suddenly thought that the person who was standing beside her had a lower cultivation than her. Even she was having a hard time, would he be able to bear it? Xiao Huan was certain that this was the person who had sold her the Yin beads the last time. Thinking that she had pulled someone else into this terrible situation, she couldn't help but feel guilty. As her pale face turned back, she saw the person behind her standing with a bowed head with his hands covered by his sleeves. Seemingly having noticed her gaze, the other suddenly raised his head and smiled at her. A smile that was as cold as the edge of a blade appeared strangely. Xiao Huan felt a gust of cold air suddenly rise from the bottom of her feet. Just at this time, a hand appeared without warning on Zhuo Mo's shoulder. Chapter 78. Making a move, the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind. When Tai Sanren had his disciple in the light purchasing the Yin beads, while he himself was concealed in the darkness. When he saw that Yun Xia Xianzi had Yin thunder beads, it was like he was struck by lightning. The many uses of Yin beads were known to all the sections. Many people know, but there were not many people that would know more than Wen Tai Sanren. In the eyes of the world, Wen Tai Sanren's origins were very mysterious. Everyone knew that he came from a small sect called Sky Fiend Sect, but it was not known that the little minor sect of Sky Fiend Sect was a branch sect which had survived the collapse of the Deviling Sect. The Deviling Sect was a famous sect 3,000 years ago. There had been many disciples and many branch sections. The Deviling Sect had all died in the great battle against the Yaoma 3,000 years ago, but many of these branch sects had luckily survived. However, without the Yin beads, the various spells they had learned from the Deviling Sect were useless. This caused some branches to decline and eventually die out. Some branches, of their own initiative, learned spells from other sects and managed to survive. The Sky Fiend Sect that Wen Tai Sanren came from was one of the surviving branch sections. Sky Fiend Sect was a very small sect. As it passed down to his generation, only he was left. However, Wen Tai Sanren was exceptionally talented. Even though the scriptures of the Sky Fiend Sect weren't anything special, he had managed to cultivate to Jindan. However, he had reached a dead end in his cultivation and it would be hard to make progress relying on these scriptures. So, it could be understood just how joyful he was when he saw the Yin Thunder Bead in Yun Xia Xianzi's hands. He knew where his sect's scriptures had originated from. The sect records had many spells relating to the Yin beads. Those strange scriptures and spells, they were hundreds of times better than the scriptures was currently using. If he could find the method to make yin beads, he had hopes that he could break through to yuanying. For Xiuzhe, the strength of cultivation directly determined their lifespan. Jindan was the first division. Before reaching Jindan, their lifespan wouldn't surpass 150 years, but once they broke into Jindan, they would have a lifespan of 300 years. Yuanying Xiuzhe would have a lifespan of 500 years. The lifespan of a Fanshu Xiuzhe could reach 700 years, and the lifespan of a Deshang Xiuzhe was 1,000 years. On the surface, Wentai Sanren didn't seem any different than any other middle-aged person, but he was already 232 years old. He didn't have much time left. So when he learned that someone knew how to make yin beads, how could he not be excited? He quickly found out the history of the yin thunder bead that Yun Xia Xianzi had, and he had sent Shui Yun to bravely go to the free market to search for the yin beads, while he would hide in the shadows. For the temptation of the yin beads, he was willing to not just cut ties with Yun Xia's group, but if he had to pay with his life, he had to grab it. When Zhuo Mo had appeared, he was excited but kept his composure. He was clear that the news of the yin beads had spread out long ago. There were many people who wanted it. He was like an experienced hunter, patiently waiting. To be able to use a normal scripture to break into Jindan, Wentai Sanren wasn't the average cultivator. The situation quickly progressed according to his plans, everyone attacking in a melee battle. As the heated battle reached its climax, he finally made a move. Using his most skilled and hidden movement method, he silently appeared behind Zhuo Mo. When his hand touched Zhuo Mo's shoulder, even if he was an experienced hunter, he couldn't help but be excited. Wentai Sanren had fortuitous encounters before. When he had been a Ningmai, he had discovered an earth-based concealment method that was extremely unique. Relying on this, he had escaped life-threatening situations multiple times. He knew he had succeeded. Damn you! The yellow-robed Taoist was the first person to detect Wentai Sanren and instantly yelled. He didn't attend to his fight with the other Xiuzhe and threw out a round gold shuttle. Once the round gold shuttle left his hand, it turned into a streak of gold light and hummed as it moved. The silver-clad male snorted and tossed a handful of silver sand, which shone like the stars, towards Wentai Sanren. The dark red rope moved like it was alive. A nimble turn and then it streaked towards Wentai Sanren, shooting like a sharp arrow, howling through the air. The other person also seemed rushed. The pale green flying sword brightened and with a clear hum, sliced at Wentai Sanren. 4 Jindan masters attacking at the same time, the resulting commotion was enough to make the sky turn dark. Wentai Sanren wasn't panicked. A smug smile appeared at the corners of his lips. Grabbing Zhuo Mo's shoulder, he was going to cast his greatest escape spell, an earth concealment spell, when his face suddenly changed. With a painful shout, he suddenly tore his body away and retreated. On his palm, at some unknown time, a dark red flame had appeared. The flame wasn't large as it burned silently, but just in an instant, Wentai Sanren's right hand had turned to white bone. Ah! Sharp yells rang over Dongfu. Wentai Sanren's pupils were dilated, his features horrific and twisted as he curled into a ball, continuously rolling on the ground. This sudden change also shocked everyone else. Zhuo Mo raised his head and reached out with his right hand, a finger gently pointing into the empty air. A strand of crimson flame silently floated in front of him. The round gold shuttle of the yellow-robed Taoist, the silver sand of the silver-clad male, the dark red rope, and the pale green flying sword all headed towards the dark red flame, like moths attracted to a flame. The expressions of the 4 people changed drastically. Just now, they had felt their talismans and flying sword had suddenly been affected by the pull of a very strong power and headed towards the silently burning crimson flame. The state of Wentai Sanren, who was rolling on the ground as he wailed piteously, also shocked everyone. The expression of the yellow-robed Taoist changed as he rapidly cast a spell, wanting to retrieve the round gold shuttle, but the gold shuttle only wavered slightly but still flew towards the flame. The silver-clad male was much smarter. Without another word, he retreated out of the battle. The mysterious master who had been using the dark red rope also had a good response. The rope, which had been like an arrow, suddenly slowed. Only the flying sword glowing with green light increased its presence as it sped up rather than slow down. The sword essence was thick, full of the resolution to not return. The gold shuttle and the silver sand, when they came into contact with the flame, was like mud entering the ocean and disappeared without a sound in the fire. The cultivator who had been controlling the dark red robe tried with all his power and finally stopped the rope from moving forward, yet the tip of the rope still came into contact with the flame. Snappis! A string of sparks, with astounding speed, leapt on the rope and headed to the other end. The cultivator who had been hiding in the shadows was alarmed. Abandoning his rope talisman, he released it and retreated. Turning into a streak of light, he fled away. When the sparks lit up the other end of the rope, bang, the dark red rope turned to ash, scattering in the wind. The green flying sword, with its murderous sword essence, accurately struck the flame in front of Zwamo's chest. There wasn't any resistance. The flying sword split the flame into two. But at the same moment, the Xiozha who had been glaring angrily in the sky suddenly spat out a ball of fresh blood, and in alarm, turned and retreated. The sword essence on the green flying sword had completely disappeared. The body of the sword had broken into tiny segments and turned to countless fragments. The yellow-robed Taoist finally lost his composure. Without being able to care for anything else, he fled in a panic. The sudden change in the situation caused all the Xiozha in the free market, visible or hidden, to gape in shock. When Tai Sanren, who had been rolling on the ground, had turned into a pile of dust with nothing remaining. In a short encounter, 5 Jindan masters, 1 dead, 1 wounded, 3 fleeing, how much power would this take? Everyone's eyes as they looked at Zwaemo all changed. The people who had been tempted by the Een beads all felt relieved that they hadn't also attacked. The enormous free market was completely silent. There was only a crimson flame burning in front of Zwamo's chest. Zwaemo reached out with a finger. The flame turned into a string and burrowed into his finger. Xiaohuan's complexion was deathly pale, her mind dazed as she stood. Her mind was completely blank. She didn't even register Zwamo's departure. Only after a long time, when her mind finally refocused, she saw Miss Paleface and couldn't resist anymore but fall into Miss Embrace and started crying. Just at this time, 2 Een beads dropped to the ground. Mistress and servant couldn't help but be shocked. Zwaemo flew forward quickly. His eyes were dark, even the blade-like smile on his face seemed to have become weak. He had leapt and flew away without anyone daring to stop him. Not one person dared to pursue him. Ditchum, that wasn't right. He suddenly stopped. A white-clothed Lin Qian appeared behind him. At this time, Lin Qian didn't seem as casual and harmless as when Zwaemo had first encountered him. All the Ling energy in his body was moving. He was like an unsheathed sword, the sword essence spreading out. His expression was grave. He didn't dare to relax as he stared fixedly at the figure that he couldn't really make out. Zwaemo gave a light laugh. "Ha ha, you're pretty brave." The voice was icy. Even though it was a laugh, it didn't have a hint of emotion. If Zwaemo was conscious, he definitely would identify it as Pu Yao's voice. Pitiful Zwaemo. In the near-death situation just now, Pu Yao finally couldn't help but interfere. Lin Qian's position didn't change. His expression was defensive, positioned so he could release his strongest attack at any time. In a deep voice, he asked, "Elder's cultivation is astounding. But why would you not let others see your true face?" Pu Yao stared at Lin Qian, the mirth on his face even thicker. "Little friend, I don't have time to play with you today. But don't worry, we will meet if there is a chance in the future." Nonsensically, he threw down, "So interesting." Ha! Before the words landed, a ball of flame rose from his feet. Lin Qian was first taken back and then shouted, "Elder, wait." Disdain appeared in Pu Yao's eyes. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared in the air. It was like Lin Qian was released from a heavy weight. He stood in his original spot. Only now did he realize that without noticing, his back was wet with sweat. How long has it been since he had been as nervous as this? Suddenly, his expression flickered and he disappeared in the wind. Just after Lin Qian disappeared, a group of people arrived at the location. It was a group clothed in black wearing masks. The person at the front suddenly came to the spot that Pu Yao had been standing and touched the ground with his hand. The patch of ground didn't seem different at all. "We're not wrong." The short words were filled with joy. But then he said in irritation, "It is a pity we're late." The crowd of black-clothed people shifted in response, but no one spoke. "This one has always been curious. What are you searching for?" A light voice landed in the ears of this crowd of black-clothed people like lightning on a clear day. The expression of all those people changed as they turned quickly. A white-clothed Lin Qian raised his feet and, step by step, neared them. "Can you tell me who the elder that was just here really is?" His expression was indifferent, but between his brows, the sword essence was thick. Chapter 79. Zhuo Mo's decisions. Zhuo Mo opened his eyes and instantly let out a wail of pain. His body felt like someone had taken a short blade and scraped all over. It was excruciatingly painful. Was he at home? What time was it? Zhuo Mo struggled up while shaking his dizzy head. He had gone to Dongfu and bought a lot of things. His gaze landed on the 100 treasures pouch. Right, and then after that? He had gone to the free market? Zhuo Mo's pupils suddenly shrunk. He remembered. In beads. It was in beads, those horrifyingly strong xiuzhe? Zhuo Mo reflexively touched himself. Even though his entire body was in pain, he was completely unharmed and wasn't lacking any arms or legs. He was still alive. He remembered he had suddenly fainted. What happened after that? How did he return to the Little West Windyard? He didn't know. Did someone rescue him? This was the first idea that appeared in his head. Even though he didn't know much, but he wasn't dumb. The forest of signs in the free market was enough to make him realize the value of the yin bead was much larger than he had imagined. Those people would have no reason to let him free. He hurried to flip through his 100 treasures pouch. When he saw the yin beads were still there, he was even more confused. He took a count and found that there were 2 less. Whichever way he looked at it, it seemed strange. He suddenly realized he could ask Pu Yao. That guy definitely would know what had happened. When Zhuo Mo entered the sea of consciousness, he was instantly shocked. The furiously dancing sea of flames of the past was now withered, the flames extremely weak like the embers left after a fire and could extinguish at any time. The 2 stars were unchanged, hanging like diamonds in the void. The sword river didn't change either, same as usual, half of it icicles moving, half of it burning with water flames. Why would it be like this? Restraining the terror in his heart, Zhuo Mo started to sprint in the direction that Pu Yao was usually at. He had a strong feeling inside that something major had definitely happened. When he reached the stele and saw Pu Yao on top of the stele, he was dumbstruck. Pu Yao's face was without any color. He was like a statue as he sat, legs coiled, on the stele, motionless. Black clouds moved around his body. "Pu!" Zhuo Mo tried to control the terror inside and called out. Pu Yao didn't respond. He was like a stone statue carved out of white marble. Zhuo Mo called a few more times. Pu Yao didn't seem to hear it. Something definitely had happened. Zhuo Mo forced himself to calm down. He carefully thought back to what happened that day. In beads. And then he connected it to Pu Yao's present state. What happened that day? It was obvious. In the eyes of high-level xiuzhe, low-level xiuzhe was like grass. When he had saw Shui Yun, he knew that he wouldn't be able to resolve it, and that was why he decided to go all in. People would kill for even a low-level talisman. How about the mysterious yin bead? Most of the yin beads he had were still present. That meant that those people hadn't got them. Had it really been Pu Yao who saved him? Zhuo Mo almost couldn't believe it. Would Pu Yao be that kind? Yet this guess seemed to be the most reasonable one. As to Pu Yao's sorry state right now, Zhuo Mo wasn't certain. Was he wounded? It seemed that it was quite serious. Even that time Pu Yao had been wounded by Xan Yenshibua, he hadn't been this weak. Looking dazedly at Pu Yao, who was completely lifeless, Zhuo Mo suddenly thought, would Pu Yao just die like this? But for some unknown reason, he pushed down the idea. This thought made him feel slightly terrified. Terrified that Pu Yao would disappear like this? Wasn't that what he had been hoping all this time? Looking at the lifeless Pu Yao, Zhuomo's eyes became murky. He closed his eyes. A beat later, he opened them again. Go wouldn't owe anyone. He was only paying back the other for saving his life, Zhuo told himself. For some unknown reason, when he made this decision, the terror inside suddenly stopped. Raising his head to glance at the statue-like Pu Yao, Zhuo took a deep breath. He started to think back to every detail of his interactions with Pu Yao, hoping to find a way to help him. The first thing he thought about was embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Pu Yao had been constantly tempting or forcing him to practice embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Zhuo remembered very clearly, it had been when he had broken through to one breath that the flame sea in his consciousness had become vigorous. Looking at the weak flames that were so weak now that it seemed as though they would extinguish at any time, Zhuo felt these crimson flames should have a very close relationship with Pu Yao. The second was Jingshi. Pu Yao always needed a lot of Jingshi. The great majority of Zhuomo's Jingshi would end up in Pu Yao's hands. Zhuo had always been slightly amazed by the great appetite Pu Yao had towards Jingshi. Even though Zhuo didn't know where Pu Yao spent the Jingshi, but it was clear that Jingshi was very important to Pu Yao. Maybe it helped Pu Yao somehow. And then it was Yin energy. Zhuo could still see the picture of Pu Yao furiously taking in Yin energy on that trip to the Sword Cave. Zhuo felt that, for Pu Yao, Yin energy was something enriching and should help him. After a long time, Zhuo concluded these 3 points. In these 3, the most difficult was Yin energy. To take in Yin energy, that needed going into the Sword Cave. When Pu Yao was conscious, entering the Sword Cave was just a matter of Jingshi. But relying just on Zhuo, the difficulty of entering the Sword Cave was very high, and basically hopeless. This was also why Zhuo would always feel his mind expand and be entranced when he browsed Elder Wei Nan's Jade Scrolls, yet when he read Embryonic Breathing Spiritual Cultivation, it was like his intestines were turned inside out and he felt that death would be welcome. Zhuo studied the basic steps in the water method many times. Even though he wasn't totally familiar, he wasn't unfamiliar with it. The uniqueness of the water method laid in that it required making a Dan embryo. The Ling Dan would be raised in the Dan embryo. The process was like people during pregnancy, extremely miraculous. The most important step of the water method was to use spells and Ling energy as channels, all kinds of materials and Ling grasses as the flesh in order to form a Dan embryo. It would not just directly decide whether a Dan would form, but any little difference could cause the Dan that would be formed to be completely different. This was one of the important reasons that the water method wasn't as popular as the fire method. It was even hard to grasp the patterns and trends involved. For Zhuo, this was undoubtedly a new challenge. Luckily, his present cultivation was much higher than Elder Wei Nan when he had first tried the water method. The writings of Elder Wei Nan was extremely detailed. Many important parts, he had repeated and narrated it over. And Zhuo had one advantage that Elder Wei Nan didn't have. Zhuo had spiritual power. His consciousness, not just Elder Wei Nan, but the Shixiang in the sect wouldn't be as strong as him. The benefits of using his consciousness had been crucial when he had been using the fire method. Taking the Ling grasses and herbs he had prepared, he went next to the Ling spring in the rock room. The Ling spring was extremely cold and was near the Ling vein. After so many years, the Ling energy in the spring was extremely dense. Along the way, Zhuo inspected the ice cloud grass that was being grown in it. Seeing that its growth was very good, he put it to the side. Focusing, Zhuo's hands was like snowflakes flying in the air. Some strangely shaped character seals that glowed slightly flew out of his hands and entered the Ling spring. When those glowing character seals entered the Ling spring, it was like there was a natural attraction between them and they slowly crowded together. Zhuo stared with wide eyes unblinkingly, the speed of his hands not slowing down. As Zhuo's finger motions changed, the glowing character seals in the Ling spring slowly moved. Like putting together puzzle pieces, the character seals slowly combined together. 2 whole hours, and Zhuo was soaked in sweat, mist coming off his body. His eyes didn't dare to move away. With the finger motions that kept on changing, Zhuo's fingers were extremely sore. But he could only grit his teeth and bear it. If he was the slightest bit lacking in attention, it meant that all his effort would be wasted. When the last glowing character seal went in, a steady embryo frame took form. A light blue light suddenly appeared and flashed around the surface of the seal characters. Zuoremo didn't dare to hesitate. Without any time to wipe away the sweat, he used a specialized spell to add in the pre-prepared materials. A while later, a light blue spherical Dan embryo quietly floated in the Ling Spring. Chapter 80, A Transformation on the Gravestone. 5 days of rest passed in the blink of an eye. Waiting for Xen Yen Sherbua's harsh training, Zuoremo accidentally found out that Sherbua had left on other matters and his training would be temporarily halted. Without anything else to do, Zuoremo could only go to find Master, but strangely she was also absent. He quickly discovered that the sect leader was not present, and neither was Yen Le Sherbua. What had happened? Of course, Zuoremo didn't know that Pu Yao's exceptionally strong display completely shocked Sky Moonjia. One encounter, 5 Jindan masters, 1 dead, 1 wounded, and 3 fled. Such terrifying strength, it was shocking to hear about. Jindan level Xiozha, in Sky Moonjia they were high-level masters that could be ranked and counted, but they were so weak against that person. This incident also was connected to many sensitive matters. Bright Wave Jia quickly responded. Almost all the high-level Xiozha in Sky Moonjia cooperated fully, and Wukong Sword Sect naturally couldn't stay out of it. Even without Xen Yen Sherbua's supervision, Zuoremo didn't dare to relax. If he didn't practice Vajra Profound Sutra, the one who would suffer would be him. He decided to stay in the little West Wind Yard and focus on cultivating. Pu Yao was still a statue, motionless. The flames in the sea of consciousness were still very weak, as though they would extinguish at any time. Only a few days later did Zuoremo, from the sound tablet, learn that Dong Fu had almost been flipped on its head, and learn what Pu Yao really did. When he heard of the dark red flame, he knew undoubtedly that it was Pu Yao. This guy didn't even inform him before taking control of his body. Zuoremo felt hatred, and Pu Yao's glorious victory of 1 against 5 made his jaw drop. Stars and daylight, a strong and mysterious fire Xiao, the long-lost Yin bead. A string of complex incidents made Sky Moonjia abnormally lively. But these didn't have much to do with Zuoremo now. Right now, he didn't dare to run out. If someone accidentally found out, he shuddered at this thought. He docilely stayed in the little yard, working hard on embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation and Vajra Profound Sutra. Compared to profound and cryptic embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, Vajra Profound Sutra progressed much more quickly. Zuoremo could clearly feel his body was much stronger than before, even though he still looked thin and weak on the surface. There wasn't any movement from the Dan embryo in the Ling Spring. Master's ban hadn't been raised, so he could not go to the Dan room of Fragrant Ginger Yard to make Dan. But all things considered, it was actually good. He could sort out and reflect on everything that happened recently. He hadn't had the time to look at the jade scroll that Li Yingfeng Shiji had given him before about Jinji. He could take the time now to study it. The Jinji in West Wind Valley needed to be constructed again. Otherwise, if the rock cave was accidentally discovered, it would be a huge blow to him. To learn Jinji, that required learning formations. Formations was something every cultivator had to learn. Forging, Dan making, seal writing, etc., etc. All of those were related to formations. The disciples of the large sects would start learning formations in Lianqi in order to form a strong foundation for their road of cultivation. But for small sects, it was basically very hard to accomplish this, Wukong Sword Sect included. After experimenting for a few days, Zuoremo raised the Jinji again. After he just finished constructing the Jinji, he saw a pink paper crane flying out of the sky. "Yi, I've been very bored recently. You need to find something to do." "But I don't know what to find to do." "What does Yi do every day?" "Cultivate." "Cultivating every day, how boring must that be?" "Other than cultivation? What else does Yi do every day?" "Other than cultivation?" Zuoremo was stuck. Other than cultivating, what else did he do? He thought for a second and then wrote, make Dan. Yi is so boring. Zhuemo suddenly was slightly irritated. Barely restraining the irritation, he wrote 3 words, "Yes, very boring." After a while, there finally wasn't any paper crane that was flying over. Zhuemo released a breath. It seemed the other person had been adequately blown away by his bland response. He returned to the stone room and started his boring cultivation. In the rock room, Zhuemo opened his eyes. His progress in embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation was extremely slow recently. It still seemed very far away from reaching third breath. He entered the sea of consciousness, wanting to check on Pu Yao. Pu Yao was still motionless like a statue. Zhuemo didn't know what to do. His own strength was extremely small. He wanted to help but had no method of helping. He was preparing to leave when he suddenly stopped in his steps. He abruptly turned and stared in disbelief at the gravestone under Pu Yao. There were words on the gravestone. There were words on the gravestone. Before, he could only barely make it out, but never had he seen it clearly. But this time he saw it clearly. He hurriedly went closer, inspecting the words on the gravestone. But after a few seconds he was struck dumb. What was written on the gravestone was none other than Vajra Profound Sutra. After practicing Vajra Profound Sutra these recent days, he was extremely familiar with the entire scripture. After reading a few lines, he realized what it was. Why would Vajra Profound Sutra be on this? Zhuemo found it very strange. If it had been some cryptic and profound scripture carved on here, he wouldn't be shocked. Vajra Profound Sutra wasn't some high-level scripture. Zhuemo himself guessed that it would be 3rd grade. Such a mysterious gravestone having Vajra Profound Sutra on it really was a strange and puzzling thing. Pushing down on the curiosity inside, he read it down character by character. Quickly, he discovered something. This Vajra Profound Sutra was slightly different from the Vajra Profound Sutra that he was practicing right now. Some places, there were additions, some places, some things were changed. Was this the true Vajra Profound Sutra? Zhuemo couldn't understand. Vajra Profound Sutra wasn't a high-level scripture. Even if it was modified, it couldn't possibly become a high-level scripture. As he thought, Zhuemo smiled self-mockingly. He was really too greedy. For a long time, the gravestone had been mysterious in Zhuemo's eyes. He had unconsciously assumed that if this gravestone was connected to a scripture, it would certainly be a strong and profound scripture. So when he saw Vajra Profound Sutra on it, he was shocked. Thinking about it, he decided to memorize the Vajra Profound Sutra on the gravestone. When he finished memorizing the text, a scene that made him gape in shock occurred. The characters on the gravestone suddenly disappeared. The black clouds that had dissipated quietly gathered again and once again shrouded the gravestone. Was it? This gravestone was telling him that he was practicing Vajra Profound Sutra wrong? He shook his head hard and threw such the strange notion to the back of his head. In any case, it was normal for anything related to Pu Yao to be strange. Leaving the sea of consciousness, it was like Zhuemo was enchanted as he started to study the 2 different Vajra Profound Sutra. The gravestone version of Vajra Profound Sutra was only different in 5 places from his previous version. Just 5 places. These 5 places he studied for a long time and made a very startling conclusion. The difference in these 5 sentences, it let this Vajra Profound Sutra walk onto 2 different roads. Other than shock, Zhuemo felt it was expected. If there wasn't a difference, he would actually find it strange. But after a deeper examination, Zhuemo was shocked once again. Because he found the gravestone version of Vajra Profound Sutra wasn't as good as the Vajra Profound Sutra that he was practicing. Zhuemo was slightly unable to accept this conclusion. Pu Yao was an antique, but what he gave, like embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, it could be seen it was a high-level thing. The gravestone that appeared together with him, how can it give a Vajra Profound Sutra that wasn't good as the normal version? Zhuemo didn't believe it. He continued his examination. There wasn't much complex content in Vajra Profound Sutra. The main focus of the entire text was to cultivate the body. The method of the Vajra Profound Sutra Zhuo Mo practiced wasn't complicated. It was using the Ling energy inside the body to temper the body. And the gravestone version of Vajra Profound Sutra was using the Ling energy that was in the world to nurture the body. Undoubtedly, the Vajra Profound Sutra that Zhuo Mo was practicing was much more effective. Even in the rock room with the Ling vein, the Ling energy in the air was far from being able to compare to the pure Ling energy in Zhuo Mo's body. Even more, strengthening was much more effective than nurturing. And the strength of the body that was produced by tempering was much better than a body that was nurtured. What was this? Zhuo Mo felt that this was a joke. Was the gravestone joking with him? As he thought, he felt it was more and more likely. Otherwise, how would there be such a coincidence? He had just practiced Vajra Profound Sutra, and then the gravestone showed Vajra Profound Sutra? Was it that Pu Yao wasn't as seriously wounded as he thought and was toying with him? Or Pu Yao was lying under the gravestone already? With Pu Yao's sense of humor, Zhuo Mo wouldn't be surprised if he didn't do anything strange and preposterous. Zhuo Mo threw the gravestone version of Vajra Profound Sutra to one side. Such an ineffective method, it was wasting time. But the change in the gravestone aroused Zhuo Mo's attention. Every day, he would go into the sea of consciousness multiple times to see if the gravestone had any new changes. What he felt regretful about was, after that, the gravestone didn't change. A quiet gravestone, a quiet Pu Yao. Zhuo Mo was slightly disappointed, but still persisted in practicing every day. But every time he would practice Vajra Profound Sutra, he would always unconsciously think about the 5 places that were different. Those 5 unfamiliar sentences were like a ghost haunting him, appearing in Zhuo Mo's mind. Quite a few times, he had almost practiced the gravestone version but managed to stop himself. Time was valuable. He couldn't deliberately waste it, Zhuo Mo thought. Practicing embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation finally showed hope for Zhuo Mo. He had almost completely disregarded the furious increase in his cultivation in the recent days. Looking at the slightly more vigorous flames in his consciousness, his mind lightened. It seemed he hadn't guessed wrong. He believed, as long as he persisted in practicing embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, there would be a day that Pu Yao would wake up. In the recent days, all the elders of the sect were absent. Zhuo Mo received a rare time of idleness. Each day, he cultivated and worked hard, time full and free. After a few days, the Lingdan in the Ling Spring would be complete. Zhuo Mo now had a deep experience of how slow the water method was. Suddenly, he heard someone yelling loudly outside the valley, "Zhuo Shixiang, Zhuo Shixiang." The voice was extremely frantic. Zhuo Mo felt it was slightly unfamiliar. It should be one of the outer sect disciples. His body flashed and he appeared at the mouth of the valley. The heads of the outer sect disciples were pouring with sweat as they panted, expressions frantic. Seeing Zhuo Mo, they instantly had a joyous expression. "Shixiang, people have come to the sect to make a disturbance, and they wounded a few of the shitty." Chapter 81 A Ling Insect. When Zhuo Mo rushed to the entrance of the mountain, he found the situation was much more serious than he had initially thought. 2 distinct groups of people surrounded the mountain gate. Zhuo Mo's gaze swept across the crowd of people that caused the disturbance. The ones who aroused Zhuo Mo's attention was 1 female and 2 males. The clothing and composure of those 3 were clearly different than the people behind them. When Zhuo Mo saw Old Black had been wounded, the anger in his heart shot up. In a stride, his body flashed and he appeared next to Old Black. Blood was seeping out of the corners of Old Black's mouth. His expression was withered. When he saw Zhuo Mo, joy made its way across his face. "What happened?" Zhuo Mo asked in a heavy voice. The spirits of the Wukong sword sect's disciples rose when Zhuo Mo appeared. "Oh, finally, there's one that is willing to stand up," one of the 2 males among the trio who was wearing a grandiose blue Ling armor said in a strange tone. "I had assumed that the inner sect disciples of Wukong sword sect are a group of turtles. Hey kid, give us your name. Where's Wei Xing? Why hasn't he come out?" Zhuo Mo didn't pay attention to him, only looking at Old Black. Old Black's face was full of bitterness. They said they wanted to find Wei Xing Shixiang to spar, but how can Wei Xing come out? So they started making a ruckus. They said if Wei Xing Shixiang isn't going to come out, they would ruin the Ling fields here. Think about it, how could I let them ruin my Ling fields? Zuermo took out a medicine pill from his clothes and shoved it to Old Black. He was a pupil of Shi Feng Rong. At the very least, he didn't lack medicine. The surrounding disciples all had admiring expressions. Putting Old Black into the care of the outer sect disciples behind him, Zuermo turned around. So it's a zombie face. Hey, you're that Zuermo. The male wearing the blue Ling armor arrogantly waved a finger and said, I heard that you are skilled at making Dan. You won't be enough, go find Wei Xing. The first genius of Dong Fu hiding? He really isn't anything. Isn't there also someone that was called something like Luoli? Which sect are you from? Zuermo calmly asked. He, we are from the Linging sect. The one who answered was the only female among the three. She wore pink peach blossom armor. Her body was extremely graceful, sweet and youthful, lights flashing in her eyes. Almost all of the gazes of Wukong Sword Sect's outer sect disciples were greedily locked on her. She wasn't embarrassed, instead she was covered in smiles. Zuermo had heard of the Ling-ing sect before. It was the wealthiest sect in Dongfu. The sect had numerous enterprises, and the disciples they admitted were mostly those of wealthy families. Unlike Wukong Sword Sect, they had an astounding number of disciples. Just the number of Zhuji disciples in Ling-ing sect was over 80 people. This number threw Wukong Sword Sect far behind them. They were first among Dongfu. However, the reputation of the Zhuji disciples of Ling-ing sect were extremely bad. What they liked to do the most was causing trouble. Many of them had a strong family background and would cause trouble in other sects, yet the other sects could only bear it. They formed groups and made trouble everywhere. Because they consumed Ling medicines from childhood, the progression of their cultivation was much faster than normal disciples. And because they were covered in talismans, if fighting occurred and they threw it down, how could normal disciples win? And if the other was stronger than them, then they would attack at once. After a while, lower-level Xiuzhou would walk around them. But they were also smart and would never provoke those truly strong people such as Yubai. They had heard that a strong person had come out of Wukong Sword Sect called Wei Sheng. He had been labeled by many as a once-in-100-years genius. They naturally wouldn't dare to cause trouble at large sects such as Dongfu Hall and Dongqi Sword Sect. But this Wukong Sword Sect, they had never heard of it before. A small sect like this, they weren't afraid at all. Due to the fact that Dongfu had been very lively this recent while, the elders of all the sects had almost all left. Such a good chance, how could they give it up? Before coming, they had especially done research. In this generation of Wukong Sword Sect disciples, the most famous was two people. The first was Wei Xing, the second was Zuermo, who was skilled in Dan making. But no one had ever seen how strong Wei Xing was. This made them even more certain that Wei Xing only had an inflated reputation. As to Zuermo, a Dan maker, what waves could he make? Other than that, there was someone called Luoli, but he was supposedly average. There were three people. The one wearing the blue Ling armor was called Yan Mingzi. The other wearing an eye-catching bright red Ling armor was called Hushan. The name of the female wearing the pink peach blossom Ling armor was called Tao Zhu Er. Oh, Zuermo expressionlessly responded. He then turned to ask Old Black, who wounded you? There's no need to ask, you did it, Yan Mingzi said disdainfully. You should go get Wei Sheng to come out. You only make Dan. Yi is almost embarrassed. The voice suddenly stopped. Yan Mingzi stared with slight shock at Zuermo. In his eyes, this little zombie in front of him seemed to suddenly change into a completely different person. That feeling, it was like a sword that was now unsheathed. It wasn't the first time that Yan Mingzi fought and caused trouble. He was very experienced. He dropped his mirthful expression and said somewhat seriously, hadn't thought that I would not see clearly. You are actually a master. The other two were also surprised. The presence Zuermo exuded definitely didn't seem like a cultivator who was obsessed with Dan making would have. But the two weren't very worried. They had hung out on the streets for this long, and the number of hard bones they had encountered couldn't be counted. Many people were more powerful than them, but weren't they all defeated in the end? Even more, this little zombie had lower cultivation than them. Zuemo didn't waste words and raised his ice crystal sword. You are really poor. Yen Mingzi roared with laughter and said with a smug face, "Take a look at Ye's flying sword." The sword was 3 feet, shaped like an elongated water droplet. The body of the sword was like the surface of a pond, dark and the bottom unfathomable. Occasionally, a streak of light would flash past and display the extravagance. The sword's name is Waterdrop, 3rd grade, and the highest quality of water element flying sword. He examined Zuemo and shook his head. Everything on your body isn't even worth a fraction of this flying sword. Zuemo completely lost the desire to converse with the other. Without another word, he attacked first. Flowing water, a Fili water sword scripture. An invisible ripple spread out in front of Zuemo. The ice crystal sword seemed to disappear and then appeared out of nowhere in front of Yen Mingzi. Yen Mingzi only seemed to see a blur before the other's flying sword suddenly was in front of him. The sword essence contained in the tip of the sword was so sharp he almost couldn't keep his eyes open. He jumped in fright. He hurriedly manipulated his flying sword to parry. The other's flying sword seemed abnormal slippery, and with a smooth curve, it nimbly avoided his flying sword and came straight at him. Yen Mingzi was in a panic, but his battle experience was much richer. He knew that the other's flying sword wasn't as good as his and decided to go for a frontal encounter. Zuemo snorted coldly. It might have been that he had interacted for too long with Pu Yao that his snort was very similar. He knew what the other was thinking. However, the quality of his ice crystal sword was far lesser than the other. If the two hit, the one who would suffer would be him. He only had this flying sword. If it was damaged here, the sect definitely wouldn't give him another one for free. But Zuemo's skill with Li water sword scripture was far better than in the past. The teachings of Xen Yenshibua had covered many of his shortcomings. The Li water sword scripture that he casted now was smooth and flowing, almost traceless. The sword scripture that the other used was also abnormally special, but it was clear that the other hadn't focused on practicing it. He wasn't able to capture the essence of many of the details. Based on the details, the other's sword scripture was slightly above Li water sword scripture. Zuemo couldn't help but shake his head. Such a good sword scripture, but the other didn't know to treasure it. He was also extremely tempted by the other's flying sword. In comparison, his ice crystal sword was extremely cheap. In reality, what Zuemo minded the most was the other's waterdrop sword was just perfect for Li water sword scripture. His ice crystal sword was appropriate for Xen Yenshibua's sword essence but wasn't suited for Li water sword scripture. Zuemo had been thinking for a long time about obtaining a flying sword suited for Li water sword scripture. His heart moved and he couldn't help but have an idea. The ice crystal sword became even harder to follow. His sword moves still followed the path of entangling and intricacies. But in all of this, there was a slight hint of explosiveness, and was full of murderous intent. This little bit of explosiveness caused Yen Mingzi to feel the pressure had increased greatly. This dissonant feeling made him extremely uncomfortable. Hu Shan and Tao Zhuer's faces were full of surprise. Yen Mingzi was in a disadvantageous position. They had to re-examine Zuemo. This Zuemo is pretty strong. Tao Zhuer's voice held surprise, different than the rumors. Didn't they say he was skilled in dan-making? The information on Wukong sword sect is already very pitifully little. How could we have researched that clearly? Hu Shan said unconcernedly. Even though he was surprised, but he was only just surprised. If Zuemo could have this kind of strength, then how strong would Wei Xing be? Tao Zhuer wondered. Hu Shan smirked. It doesn't matter how strong they are. They have become too well known recently. Many of the Shixiang and Shiji have noticed them. Supposedly, the Shirshu also do not have good feelings about Wukong sword sect. Tao Zhuer smiled. Yes, Dongfu is only this big. A new one that is coming to divide it? How could the miserly Shirshu of the sect be willing? Hu Shan said indifferently, in any case, it isn't our problem. But I heard that their elders are pretty strong. They're strong, but are they as strong as Jingshi? Tao Zhu Er gave a light laugh. Ha, right? Hushan laughed. As the two talked, the battle situation changed. Yan Mingzi suddenly didn't dodge anymore. The ice crystal sword pierced his Ling armor. It gave a clear ring but didn't leave a mark on the Ling arm. Zuermo couldn't help but pause. During his period of distraction, Yan Mingzi's water drop sword suddenly attacked. It was like an icy water sword. Zuermo hurriedly turned his body. He felt a gust of coldness brush past his arm. Ha! Just a second-grade flying sword, how can it break through my black water Ling armor? Yan Mingzi laughed smugly, his sword presence become even more bold. Tao Zhu Er didn't seem surprised at the scene occurring and felt it was boring. She couldn't help but say, only knowing to use status to bully others, it's so boring. As she talked, she organized the petals on her peach blossom Ling armor. A smirk was on Hushan's face as he watched the ice crystal sword strike Yan Mingzi's Ling armor again. It was useless, don't you understand? If you want to blame someone, just blame it on the fact you weren't born into a good family. He looked with some sympathy at Zuermo. Yan Mingzi didn't seem to have any hint of dodging. He was very confident in the Ling armor he was wearing. But when the soft and weak ice crystal sword just touched the black water Ling armor, a change suddenly happened. Chapter 82. If people don't get ill-gotten gains, they won't be rich. A burst of dense sword essence flowed into the Ling armor and silently snuck into Yan Mingzi's body. Yan Mingzi only felt an extremely cold needle suddenly burrow into his body. His body instantly froze. Light flashed in Zuermo's eyes as he found the opportunity he had been waiting for. With a short bark, he started Vajra Profound Sutra, silently. A faint layer of gold suddenly floated on his sky. His legs suddenly pushed and like an arrow, his body shot out. Yan Mingzi's expression suddenly changed. But his body was still frozen. What spell was this? Zuermo's goal wasn't Yan Mingzi but the now uncontrolled water drop sword that was floating midair. It really was a good sword. The gold-glowing right hand grasped the handle of the water drop sword and the Ling energy inside his body flooded inside the water drop sword. As expected, joy made its way inside Zuermo's heart. The other hadn't put much effort into imprinting the sword. The bit of consciousness inside the water drop sword was pitifully weak. Zuermo easily erased it. The water drop sword shook 2 times in Zuermo's hand before becoming motionless. It took a lot of time and countless effort to slowly imprint a flying sword before it would be easily controlled, and also, to not be easily stolen by others. Some strong people would construct layers of Jinji inside the sword. If a person would try to steal the sword like Zuermo did, they would be wounded instead. But Zuermo had guessed that this person wouldn't spend a lot of time imprinting the flying sword. He had guessed correctly. This change occurred very quickly, so quickly everyone gaped, the surroundings deadly silent. Yan Mingzi was dumbstruck. He had never thought that the other person was targeting his water drop sword. When he felt the connection he had to the water drop sword disappear, his expression changed dramatically. Zuermo contently put the water drop sword in the 100 treasures pouch at his waist. His mood was great. He assumed a proper composure as he said to Yan Mingzi, "This sword, it will count as the price you pay for offending our sect. Next time, don't do something as silly as this." What he had just used was the tidal sword essence of Xen Yen Sherbua, extremely een and extremely cold. Without any defenses, Yan Mingzi had taken a huge blow. You, Yan Mingzi's finger shook as he pointed at Zuermo, his face pale, so angry he couldn't talk. But he didn't have the water drop sword anymore and couldn't do anything to Zuermo. Haha. This is so funny. Hushan laughed heartlessly, covering his stomach. He was laughing so hard he almost couldn't breathe. Old Yen, it's so funny. Even your sword was stolen. Old Yen, you're definitely the first in our sect. Hee. Brother Yen, you're too amusing. Tao Zhu Er laughed, looking like a flower and unable to stop. Yan Mingzi didn't know what to say. But when he saw Zuermo's eyes sweep across the Ling armor on his body over and over, His heart jumped and he hurried back a few steps. He had lost in a muddle. Even now, he didn't understand why he had suddenly froze. What spell had the other used? Today, he really had been humiliated. Yan Mingzi's heart bled blood. The sound of Hushan and Tao Zhu-er's laughter was abnormally dissonant. He had lost great face. Even if they would defeat Zhuo Emo together and he would take back the water drop sword, when they returned, Hushan and Tao Zhu-er would certainly spread this incident far and wide. If the sword was lost, then it was lost. But if this incident passed back to the sect, he wouldn't be able to keep his head up ever again. He wasn't someone kind. He was angrier at Hushan and Tao Zhu-er than at Zhuo Emo. He was very shocked at Zhuo Emo's skills. He couldn't understand it all. He looked at the two people who were bent over in laughter and smirked inside. Those two definitely wouldn't have detected what had happened. The paralysis just now, it was completely silent, without a hint of warning. After thinking it through, he calmed down. He purposefully said in an enraged voice, "Hushan, haven't you been yearning for my blue three-eyed python? If you take back water drop sword for me, I'll give it to you." Hushan didn't laugh anymore. He tilted his head and seriously looked at Yan Mingzi. "Really?" Yan Mingzi smirked inside. On the surface, he nodded rapidly. "Of course, with Tao Zhu-er as witness, will I not pay up?" "Okay." Hushan's face was happy as he sniffed. "Old Yan, you couldn't even beat trash like this. You have really deteriorated. You have to practice more. Otherwise, when I bring you out to make trouble, wouldn't you lose the face of our Linging sect?" Yan Mingzi hated Hushan for saying such ugly words. Inside, he hoped for Zhuo Emo to turn Hushan to minced meat. His mouth went, "Wait until you get water drop sword back before you waste words." Hushan took a step out and smiled widely at Zhuo Emo. "You're an interesting guy. If you obediently give up the water drop sword, I'll let you go once." The meat that reached his mouth, there wasn't a reason to spit it out. Zhuo Emo was too lazy to respond to him. He examined Hushan. He suddenly discovered this was a glittering golden road to becoming rich. That water drop sword, it was extremely expensive. Don't think that Zhuo Emo had more money after learning to make Dan, but if this water drop sword was in the talisman stores of Dongfu, Zhuo Emo could only look at it. He definitely couldn't afford it. Now it had landed in his wallet. If he converted it to Jingshi, he suddenly realized, what was faster than taking something? What was more enjoyable than justifiably stealing something? Zhuo Emo reached out with a hand. The ice crystal sword once again came in front of him. He said in a righteous voice, "You dare to bully us, Wukong. One-on-one, your Linging sect, you really isn't afraid." The disciples behind Zhuo Emo looked with admiration at him. As expected, when he provoked them, Hushan's expression wasn't happy. "Humph, the bottom of the barrel and really think you are something. I had originally thought to let you off, but since you didn't realize," a dash of silver light flashed in the air and landed in front of Hushan. "Coward! Dare to use an ambush!" Hushan was both shocked and angry. A blazing saber appeared in his hand. Flames danced wildly along the long blade of the saber, burning fiercely. Even far away, Zhuo Emo felt the incoming heat. It was another good talisman. Zhuo Emo's eyes turned red. This blazing saber, it definitely was the highest quality of the 3rd grade and wasn't lower than the water drop sword he had just taken. He hurriedly moved the ice crystal sword away. Water and fire opposed each other and depended on which was stronger. Zhuo Emo was certain that if he wasn't careful and was trapped by the other's flame, the ice crystal sword would probably melt into a puddle of water. He had heard before that the scriptures of Linging sect was extremely broad. He hadn't thought that they would have something as rare as a saber scripture. The great majority of the sects in Sky Moon Jie were based primarily on cultivating the sword. It was very rare to find Xiuzhe that practiced the saber. The other's blazing saber carelessly swiped, and there would be a burst of hot flame and air that opposed him. The road that Li Water Sword scripture walked was the one of lightness and careful intricacies. However, the difference between the two talismans was too great. The ice crystal sword basically couldn't go near the other, and so the sword scripture naturally wasn't effective. The Ling armor on the other's body was also unordinary. Red light flashed, and made Hushan look like a god in a mortal world. "Ha! Weren't you acting brave just now? Be brave." Hushan laughed, extremely pleased. The saber presence on his hand roiled and waves of flames chased after Zuemo as he jumped and dodged. Shock was on the faces of all the Wukong sword sect disciples, and they all retreated. The fire wave from Hushan's blazing saber was extremely hot. Everywhere it went, it left behind scorch marks. As they said, people died for wealth, birds died for food. Zuemo tragically thought as his brain calculated rapidly. The other's saber scripture was clearly less than Yen Mingzi's sword scripture, but in cooperation with this high-quality blazing saber, the power was astounding. Good saber, good saber. Zuemo's eyes was so red fire could shoot out as he made a sorry figure dodging about. The other's saber presence wasn't fierce enough. Otherwise, the fire waves could continuously come and Zuemo wouldn't be able to avoid it. It wasn't that Zuemo didn't have a solution, but that solution. Gritting his teeth, he decided to go through with it. But even if he was going all in, he had to earn back his cost. As he jumped and dodged, his eyes scanned the other's body, looking for a target. When his eyes landed on the jade pendant that was hanging from the other's waist, his eyes couldn't help but light up. Good talisman. The jade pendant was of an old style of construction, the entire body constructed by a kind of red jade. There wasn't any impurities in the red. A black bead was encrusted in the middle. There were a few formations carved on the jade pendant. Zuemo recognized one of them. It was called a streaming fire core management formation. This was a formation that could increase the wearer's sensitivity to fire and also increase their control over fire. The streaming fire core management formation was extremely useful. For low-level Xiuzhe, it was something out of their dreams. However, the requirements for making the streaming fire core management formation were extremely strict. Zuemo couldn't bear to use it on a regular basis. This jade pendant was able to have a streaming fire core management formation. Its quality wasn't ordinary. Zuemo deeply realized a phrase: when the profit was large enough, it was enough for people to risk it. All in. Zuemo made the decision and quickly calmed down. He needed to find a chance to knock out his opponent in one blow. The waves of fire turned. The flames on the body of the saber didn't seem as though they would become weaker. Hushan was completely protected by layers of flames. Zuemo couldn't get near. Zuemo was extremely sneaky. The waves of fire didn't even touch his hair. Hushan became slightly fidgety and the saber presence was even more rushed. This group of people, they really were wasting good things. Zuemo's heart was full of scorn. Such a good saber, landing in the hands of these people, it was a pearl in the hands of swine. The other's saber presence sped up. It seemed more dangerous, but Zuemo could detected that the other wasn't able to control all of it. After Zuemo had comprehended Xen Yen Sherbua's tidal sword essence, his perception of presence had become extremely sensitive. Due to his long-term practice of comprehending Li water sword essence, it had deepened his understanding of presence. It was the same rationale for sword and saber essence. What they were after was strength used appropriately. It wasn't the energy used was more, the presence stronger, and so the power would always be greater. This was a chance. Zuemo's pupils suddenly shrunk. He accurately caught the other's minor weakness. Having waited for a long time, he instantly acted. The ice crystal sword that had been swimming beside him like a fish gave out a light sound. Traveling along the spot where the layers of fire were the thinnest, it pushed in strongly. Halfway, the ice crystal sword turned into an extremely cold stream of water. This wasn't due to being melted by the fire but the result of Zuemo actively and furiously pushing Ling energy in, metamorphosis. Metamorphosis was an upper-level trick of sword scriptures. Xen Yen Sherbua's ice dragon was a high-level metamorphosis of his sword. Zuemo's power right now wasn't enough for metamorphosis. Just having touched sword essence, he could only use the dumbest and the simplest way. That was, putting large amounts of Ling energy into the flying sword, pushing it to turn back to its original form and stimulating the power of its origins. It could only count as the lowest type of metamorphosis. Basically, no one would use this kind of metamorphosis because after doing it, the flying sword was ruined. This was also why Zuemo had hesitated for so long. But after balancing the benefits and costs, he still decided to use this move. After making the decision, he didn't have any hesitations, no pauses. He had been preparing for a long time, acting it out repeatedly inside. How could he not have any chance of success? The ice crystal sword, now a stream of cold water, pushed through the layers of fire as its power increased. The cold energy was enough to freeze the surrounding flames. Hushan's face paled. He furiously moved the blazing sword, waves of fire continuously forming in hopes that they would block this extremely cold water. However, Zuemo had planned for such a long time, had even paid the price of ruining the ice crystal sword. How could he stop there? Chapter 83, Brute Force. Just as Hushan was furiously waving the blazing saber, the cold water that had pierced the flames suddenly exploded, turning into 7 streams and landing around Hushan. The 7 streams were thin, filled with a white cold energy. They revolved rapidly, hissing as they moved. 7 whirlpools. 7 bunches of cold energy and sword energy formed whirlpools. They were like the pillars of a cage, imprisoning Hushan. The whirlpools were moving shocking fast, like a miniature tornado. It had a strong suction power. Everywhere it went, the layers of flames were consumed so nothing was left. Shock appeared on Tao Zhu and Yen Mingzi's faces as they stared in disbelief at the battle. The other sect disciples who were behind Zuemo were extremely excited and were intoxicated by the fight. Terror made its way onto Hushan's face. Surrounding him, 7 groups of water and fire entwined to become long whirlpools. They were like 7 thin pillars that securely trapped him. The bang and hiss of water and fire meeting signaled just how unstable it was and expressed the terrifying power that was in them. No! Hushan shouted in hopelessness, his left hand quickly going into the 100 treasures pouch at his waist. Boom! The 7 fire and water whirlpools exploded at the same time. The pitiful Hushan, who just had taken out an armor seal, was swallowed by countless flames and tiny icicles. The explosion dissipated, leaving behind smoke which faded as people made out Hushan's state. That grandiose red Ling armor was now dim and dirty, a layer of ash over the top. There were many small marks on the surface of the Ling armor. Hushan's tied-up hair had been blown into a bird's nest, his face ashy and black. Some strands of lingering smoke rose up from his face and head. The flame had completely disappeared from the blazing saber on his hand, nothing remaining of the presence it previously had. His right hand holding the bottom half of an armor seal that he didn't have the time to use. His entire person was charred like burnt wood. The jade pendant actually hadn't been damaged at all. Zuemo released a breath. He silently started Udra Profound Sutra and cautiously walked in front of Hushan. Glancing at Hushan and seeing that the other didn't seem to have responded, Zuemo wasn't courteous as taking off the red jade pendant at Hushan's face. After taking it, he looked with some regret at the blazing saber on Hushan's hand and the Ling armor on his body. Those 2 were also good things. However, Zuemo knew that people couldn't go over the line. Right now, he took the jade pendant. That was his prize for winning. It wasn't outrageous. However, if he cleaned off the other person, then he could just wait for them to come back and kill him. Also, Zuemo didn't let down his defenses. His left hand had always been inside his own 100 treasure pouch, touching the water drop sword that he had just obtained. He hurriedly left behind his own imprint. Even though, in this short amount of time, he couldn't imprint the sword and could only leave behind the simplest impression, but the ice crystal sword had been destroyed and he had no weapon. The other was also not just one person. Haha! Yen Mingzi saw that Zuemo had taken Hushan's jade pendant and couldn't stop himself from laughing smugly. He was very clear just how much Hushan treasured his jade pendant. Seeing Hushan had lost more than time, his damage even greater, Yen Mingzi recovered his sense of equilibrium. He didn't seem to find it so painful anymore at losing the water drop sword. Looking at Hushan's sorry state, Tao Zhu also couldn't stop herself from giggling. But her eyes as she looked at Zuemo had some more shock and curiosity. Hushan slowly came back. Seeing Zuemo right in front of him, hatred rose, and with a hateful shout, raised the saber to cleave the other in half. Zuemo, who had already had his defenses up, attacked even more quickly. Like lightning, he reached out with his gold-glowing right hand and accurately grabbed Hushan's neck. Then he gave a hard pull. Crack! A muffled sound like a head hitting a rock. Hiss! The sound of inhales rose in the surroundings. Everyone looked dazedly at Zuemo. Their mouths were wide. They had completely lost the ability to speak. Still a little bit painful. Zuemo bared his teeth and then threw the unconscious Hushan on the ground. His right hand rubbed hard at his forehead. His forehead was perfectly unharmed, and on Hushan's forehead, a bloody flower was blooming. How hard would he need to be before a flying sword couldn't wound him? Zuemo thought as he rubbed his glittering forehead. But he was quite satisfied. He hadn't wasted the pain and effort he put into training his body. Still want to fight? He asked Tao Juer. In reality, when he asked this, he was not very confident. But his zombie face that could not show any emotion was like that of a skilled master. Additionally, Tao Juer had completely been amazed by Zuemo's abnormal attack. At this time, she didn't know what to answer with. If you don't want to fight, take him away. Gu is very busy. Zuemo took the opportunity to stop the other's words. He waved his hand, turned and made to leave. Wait! Tao Juer suddenly called him. Zuemo's heart jumped. Did she still want to fight? Right now, his flying sword had been destroyed. If he wanted to control the water drop sword as he wished, it couldn't be done in such a short amount of time as this. He had also used up the majority of Ling energy in his body. What else do you want? He turned and pretended to ask discontentedly. Wukong sword sect, as expected, is strong. But since you have put down a challenge of one-on-one, us Ling Ying sect disciples will naturally battle to the end. In the future when we ask for guidance, please do not avoid. Tao Juer stared at Zuemo and stated. She had to admit they had been caught off guard today and lost to the other. But Zuemo's expression, which looked as though he didn't think anything of them, how could these arrogant and brash wastrels swallow it? However, if she had to go up, she didn't dare to. This person in front of her, she couldn't seem to see him clearly. Especially Zuemo's last head attack. Humph, humph, such a fun thing, how can it be just the three of them that played? Tao Juer thought cunningly. She believed that many people in the sect would be interested. At this time, Zuemo couldn't wait for those people to leave immediately. He didn't even think, waved his hand to send them away. Fine. Finishing, he turned around. With the admiring gazes of the outer sect disciples behind him, he floated away. This time, he didn't hear Tao Juer speak again. Zuemo finally released a breath. Tao Juer bit her lips. She had never been dismissed like this, had never been hurried away like this. Sometimes, the hatred of a woman would germinate from a very small detail. Just wait. She thought hatefully. Zuemo returned to the little west wind yard and caressed the two talismans he took. They were really good things. The more he looked, the more he liked it. He really profited today. As to the consequences, they were completely thrown to the back of his head. In his mind, these two fine third-grade talismans, they were worth anything. After recovering his Ling energy in the stone room, Zuemo started to imprint the water drop sword. As he carried out the imprinting, he discovered that the water drop sword lived up to being the finest among the third-grade flying swords. The body of the water drop sword was extremely soft and could curve in any direction. It also contained an extremely large amount of black water. In reality, it was a water sword. The Ling energy could reach every part of the sword, and due to its softness, Zuemo was able to, through manipulating Ling energy, change the shape of the flying sword. It was as though it had been custom-made for Li water sword scripture. From the time he got it, other than imprinting it, Zuemo put it in the Ling spring in the rock roam. The Ling energy of the Ling spring was lively and rich. To put it in there and slowly nurture it, it was especially helpful for increasing the nimbleness of the water drop sword. As for the jade pendant, Zuemo wore it every day. He finally understood the formations on the jade pendant. The jade pendant had 3 formations. Other than flowing fire core management formation, there was also clear heart incantation and ling gathering formation. Nothing needed to be said more about streaming fire core management formation. Clear heart incantation nurtured the mind, and ling gathering formation could gather the ling energy in the surroundings and was very practical. If Mo didn't have the ling vein in the rock room, ling gathering formation would definitely be one of the formations he wanted to get the most. The ling gathering formation on the jade pendant was just the most basic ling gathering formation, but the effects were extremely evident. When Mo wore the jade pendant as he meditated in the rock room, the efficiency would increase by 1/10. Don't underestimate the 1/10. Accumulating over time, the gap it caused was extremely large. Ling gathering formations were one of the most well-studied formations. At the same time, it was also called the formation that was created through Jingshi. It consumed large amounts of Jingshi. So for the simpler ling gathering formation, it wasn't as practical as taking ling energy from the Jingshi. But if it had to be constructed on the jade pendant, other than needing the forger to be knowledgeable about the ling gathering formation, but the material it was constructed on had to be able to gather ling energy already. Materials that could gather ling energy as one of its attributes, all of them were extremely expensive. On this jade pendant, the most valuable was this nondescript ling gathering formation. It was even more valuable than the streaming fire core management formation. Just this ling gathering formation, it was enough to elevate this jade pendant into 3rd grade. It was a pity that he couldn't make Dan right now. Otherwise, he really wanted to try out the effects of the streaming fire core management formation. Mo probably wouldn't have thought the incident of him defeating the troublemakers of Ling Ying sect would have more of an effect with the outer sect disciples than his battle with Luo Li in the sect assessment. For outer sect disciples, the person who was stronger would make them respect him, but the Shixiang who was willing to protect them and their profits, he would be more loved by them. This battle, Mo had received great experience. Actually, based on cultivation, he didn't have much of a difference than Hu Shan and Yan Mingzi. He was even slightly weaker than them. The reason that he could win came from the fact that he had comprehended sword essence. Regardless of whether it was Exen Yen Sherba's tidal sword essence or the Li water sword essence, his understanding of the sword scripture, of presence, far surpassed the others. Combined with the others' underestimation of him, that was how he had so easily won. Otherwise, the person who would have lost would have probably been him, especially if Hu Shan had used the armor seal just a step earlier. Thinking about it, Mo couldn't help but rage. Was this group of people fighting? They were just throwing Jingshi. He pretty much was drooling at the grandiose talismans. They could carelessly use things like an armor seal. He felt pain on their behalf. Squander. They were truly squandering everything. What also caught Mo's attention was Vajra Profound Sutra. No matter if it was against Yan Mingzi or Hu Shan, Vajra Profound Sutra had been very effective and pivotal in battle. It seemed that he had to put more time into Vajra Profound Sutra. This thing wouldn't just save his life. It seemed to have other effects as well. But when he thought about Vajra Profound Sutra, he remembered the gravestone version of Vajra Profound Sutra. The 5 bits that had been modified haunted his mind and would pop up occasionally. Especially when he was practicing Vajra Profound Sutra, he couldn't stop himself from thinking about the 5 different parts. It drastically impacted the efficiency of his practice. Why don't I try it? Mo thought hesitantly. They are tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.